You dressed without hurry because there was no reason to hurry. The tunic you pulled over your head was made of coarse linen, the color of unbleached wool, and it smelled of sun and old sweat, and the faint tang of the soil from yesterday's work. You laced your leggings slowly, wrapping the leather thongs around your calves with the same motions you had made 1,000 times before, each loop familiar to your fingers in a way that required no thought. The window of the house was nothing more than a small opening covered with a piece of oiled cloth, but through its thin membrane you could see that the sky was already the color of tarnished pewter, bleached of blue by the weight of the heat that would come later. Outside, the village waited in a silence that had grown deeper with each passing week of the drought. You stepped through the low doorway and stood for a moment in the lane, your shadow falling short and squat against the ground because the sun was still low, just pulling itself above the line of thatched roofs to the east. The air was warm even at this hour, lacking the coolness that mornings once held in wetter years, and it carried the smell of dry thatch and powdered clay and the faint distant odor of the river, which had shrunk to a narrow ribbon of brown water between cracked mud banks. No birds sang. They had moved farther downstream weeks ago to find what little moisture remained, and now the only sounds were the creak of a door somewhere down the lane and the soft rustle of your own feet in the dust. You turned left and walked toward the small lean-to attached to the side of the house, a shelter built of rough poles and a roof of rye straw that had bleached to silver under the unrelenting sun. This was where you kept your tools, the simple implements of a well-digger's trade. You ducked under the low eave and stood in the cool shadow, letting your eyes adjust to the dimness before reaching for the first item, the wooden bucket. You lifted it with both hands and held it at chest height, turning it slowly to examine the staves. The wood was dry, so dry that the iron hoops that bound it had become slightly loose, and you could see gaps between the planks where the fibers had shrunk away from one another in the heat. You set the bucket down and reached for a small mallet, tapping the hoops gently, one after another, driving them tighter against the wood until the vessel felt solid again under your palm. The sound of the mallet was a dull, soft thud that did not travel far, swallowed up by the stillness of the morning. Next was the rope. It hung from a peg on the wall, a coil of thick hemp as wide around as your forearm, its surface rough and hairy with fibers that caught the light. You took it down and laid it on the ground in a long loop, running your hand along its entire length to check for warm spots. The hemp was hot to the touch, having absorbed the warmth of the previous afternoon and held it through the night, like a stone holds the sun. You found no fraying, no weak strands, only the familiar grit of dirt and old wax rubbed into the fibers to keep them from rotting. Coiling the rope again took time, and you let it take time, winding it in wide circles around your elbow and thumb, each loop identical to the one before, a quiet rhythm that asked nothing of your mind. You gathered the other things you would need: a leather hod for carrying spoil, its strap darkened with sweat and age, a short iron digging bar with a blunt, wedge-shaped end polished bright by friction with the earth, and a wooden peg with a length of string wound around it, the tool for marking the circle of the well. You carried these items out into the lane one by one, piling them beside the door, and then you stood looking at them for a long moment, letting the plan of the day settle into your bones in the same way that the heat was already beginning to settle into the village. The bread was hard and dark, baked 3 days ago from the last of the rye flour that had been ground before the mill pond dried to a muddy puddle. You broke off a piece and ate it standing, chewing slowly because chewing slowly made the small amount of food seem larger, and because there was no reason to swallow quickly. The bread had little taste beyond the faint sourness of rye and the grit of stone dust from the mill, but it filled your stomach with a dense, quiet weight. You drank from a clay cup, the water stored in a tall jug that sat in the coolest corner of the house, and the water was warm but wet, and that was enough. The village square lay at the center of a web of narrow lanes, and you walked toward it now with your tools in hand, the bucket bumping gently against your leg with each step. The square was an open space of hard-packed earth, large enough for a market that had not been held in 2 months because there was nothing left to trade. In its exact center, a circle had been scratched into the ground with the point of a stick some weeks ago, a ring about 4 feet across, the mark of the spot the elders had chosen for the new well. You would watch them walk the square with a forked willow branch, their steps slow and deliberate, their faces drawn with the worry they did not speak aloud. The branch had bent toward the earth at this precise place, a sign the old people trusted, even though the ground here looked no different from the ground anywhere else, pale and cracked and ungiving. You set your tools down beside the circle and straightened up, letting your gaze move across the square. To your left stood the low stone wall of the churchyard, the stones themselves sweating in the morning humidity that would burn off within the hour. To your right was the village common house, its great door standing open to admit what little breeze might stir, though none stirred now. And all around, the roofs of the houses, thatched the color of old straw, some showing patches of darker reed where leaks had been mended in years past. No one was about except for a single figure, an old man who sat on a bench against the common house wall, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance that held neither interest nor expectation. He did not speak when you arrived, and you did not speak to him. There had been a time when men called out greetings at the start of a day's work, but the drought had worn away such small courtesies like water wears a stone, leaving only the essential shapes of things. You knelt beside the marked circle and placed your palm flat against the earth. The ground was hot, even now, the heat of yesterday trapped just below the surface and radiating upward through the layer of dust that covered everything. Under your hand the soil was hard, packed down by the feet of generations of villagers who had walked this square for markets and festivals and the quiet business of daily life. Now it was beginning to crack, thin fissures running from the edge of the circle outward like the web of veins on the back of an old hand. You pressed your fingers into one of the cracks and found it dry to a depth of several inches. No moisture at all, just the crumbly texture of baked clay and silt. The iron digging bar lay beside you, and you picked it up now, feeling its weight in your hands, the familiar heft of the metal that you had held for so many hours in the past weeks as you worked on the other well, the one that had gone dry at the end of June. That well still stood at the edge of the village, its stone mouth surrounded by a circle of damp that had faded and then vanished entirely, leaving only a dark hole that gave back no reflection when you leaned over its rim. The elders had decreed a new well must be dug, deeper this time, reaching farther into the earth where the water might still hide, and you were the one chosen to dig it because you had dug before, because your father had dug before, because your father had dug before, because the work was in your blood in a way that required no explanation. You positioned the tip of the bar at the edge of the marked circle, choosing a spot where the ground was particularly hard and pale. Then you lifted the bar a few inches and let it fall, not with great force but with a controlled, patient weight, its wedge-shaped tip striking the earth with a sound that was not loud but was the only sound in the square. The noise was a dull chink, muffled by the density of the baked surface, and it left behind a small scar, a pale gouge in the darker crust. You moved the bar an inch to the left and let it fall again, and again, and again, each strike producing the same quiet note, the same small mark, until a line of broken earth began to trace the outer edge of the future well. This was how the work began, not with great tearing or upheaval, but with a slow and methodical breaking of the surface, one small piece at a time. The bar rose and fell in your hands, and the sun climbed higher, and the heat began to build in earnest, pressing down on your shoulders and the back of your neck. You worked without speaking, without looking up except to mark your progress along the circle, and the old man on the bench did not move except once, to shift his weight and cross his arms the other way. The first layer of earth came away in flat, irregular chunks, some as large as your palm, others crumbling into smaller fragments as soon as you pried them loose. You gathered these pieces with your hands, scooping them into the leather hod, and the texture of the soil was remarkable in its dryness. When you picked up a piece and squeezed it in your fist, it did not clump but disintegrated, flowing out between your fingers like coarse sand, leaving your palm stained the pale brown of old bone. There were no worms in this earth, no beetles, no roots of grass because the grass had died back to the crowns and the crowns had withered to nothing. The soil was sterile, inert, a substance that had forgotten what it meant to grow things. You worked your way around the entire circle once, breaking the surface to a depth of perhaps 4 inches, creating a shallow ring of disturbed ground. The effort was not great, but the heat made every movement seem slower, heavier, as if the air itself had grown thick and resistant. Sweat gathered on your forehead and ran down the sides of your face in slow, distinct drops that fell onto the dry earth and vanished instantly, leaving no mark, no hint of moisture. You wiped your face with your sleeve more from habit than necessity, for the linen was already as warm as your skin and offered no cooling relief. When the circle was fully outlined, you stood up and stretched your back, looking down at your work. The ring was visible now, a pale scar on the darker, undisturbed ground, its shape slightly irregular, but close enough to true that the eye accepted it as a circle. You walked around it slowly, one full circuit, checking the width with your eye, noting a spot on the eastern side where the line had wandered slightly outward. You knelt and corrected it with a few careful taps of the bar, then rose again and nodded to yourself, a small motion that no one saw. The village was waking now, if waking was the right word for the slow, reluctant stirring that passed for morning activity in this drought summer. You heard a door open somewhere behind you, then the muffled voice of a woman calling to a child, then the soft scrape of a wooden bucket being set on a stone step. None of these sounds seemed to belong to the same world you inhabited at this moment, bent as you were over the pale circle of earth that would become the mouth of the well. You felt distant from the village, separate in your purpose, though you were standing in the very center of its common ground. The tools waited beside the circle, in a neat row. The digging bar, the wooden bucket now repaired and ready, the coil of rope, the leather hod stained dark with the sweat of your hands. You looked at them for a moment, letting the image of their arrangement settle into your mind as a kind of map for the hours ahead. Then you looked up at the sky, which was no longer the color of tarnished pewter, but had paled to a flat, washed-out white, as if the blue had been bleached away entirely by the sun's long dominion. There were no clouds. There had been no clouds for many days, and the sky had become a thing you did not look at often, because it offered nothing but the promise of more heat, more dryness, more of the same unbroken stillness. You knelt again and picked up the bar, and this time you did not work along the edge of the circle, but instead drove the tip directly into the center of the enclosed space. The earth here was just as hard, just as dry, but it broke under the steady pressure of the iron in the same quiet way, offering small pieces that you lifted out and set aside. You worked without haste, without any sense that you were racing against the sun or the hour or the need of the village. The work was simply there in front of you, and you did it because it was what you were there to do, because the well needed to be dug and you were the one who dug wells. The morning passed in this way, in the slow accumulation of small actions. Lift the bar, let it fall, loosen a piece of earth, lift it out, place it in the hod, slide the hod aside when it grew heavy, empty the hod onto the growing pile of spoil at the edge of the square. The pile grew slowly, a low mound of pale brown soil and small stones and fragments of the dead grass that had once covered this ground. It looked like a small grave, you thought, then pushed the thought away, because it was nothing like a grave. It was only dirt, only the first of the earth that would be removed, and there would be much more before you were finished. By the time the sun stood directly overhead and the shadows had shrunk to narrow dark lines at the bases of the walls, you had excavated the circle to a depth that reached your knees when you stood inside it. You climbed out and sat on the rim, your legs dangling into the shallow pit, and you looked at the walls of the excavation. They were straight enough, vertical cuts through the dry topsoil and the hard pan beneath, and they showed a cross-section of the village's history. An inch of grey dust, then 3 inches of brown loam, then the yellow clay that underlay everything, hard and unyielding as fired brick. The colours were all variations of brown and tan and pale ochre, muted and dusty, and even the newly exposed faces of the clay were dry, showing no gleam of moisture, no sheen that might hint at water deeper down. You ate another piece of the hard bread and drank from the water skin you had brought with you, the water tasting faintly of leather and warm from the sun's touch. The old man on the bench had gone inside some time during the morning, and the square was empty now except for you and the hall and the tools. The silence was complete, broken only by the distant sound of someone chopping wood. Somewhere beyond the farthest houses, the dull, rhythmic impact of blade against dry timber carrying across the still air, with a clarity that made it seem closer than it was. When the bread was finished and the water skin recorked and set aside in the meagre shade of the spoils pile, you lowered yourself back into the hole and picked up the bar again. The work continued as it had begun, with the same steady, unhurried rhythm, the same quiet sounds, the same accumulation of small pieces of earth lifted out and set aside. The hole deepened by inches, slowly, so slowly, that if you'd stepped away and returned an hour later, you might not have noticed any change at all. But you were inside the hole, and you felt the change in the angle of the walls as they rose around you, in the way the light from above fell differently on the clay, in the increasing effort required to lift the heavier chunks of the deeper layers up and over the rim. The afternoon wore on, and the heat became a physical presence, a weight that pressed down from above and radiated up from below, surrounding you, enveloping you in a blanket of warmth that was not unpleasant, but simply there, like the air itself. You worked more slowly now, pausing more often to wipe your face or to rest your arms, but you did not stop. The well-digger's trade was one of endurance, not speed, and you had learned long ago that the earth would yield at its own pace and no faster. You could not hurry the clay. You could only remove it piece by piece, inch by inch, until the hole was deep enough to reach the water that must be there, somewhere below, hidden in the darkness of the deep ground. As the afternoon turned toward evening, and the shadows began to lengthen once more, stretching out from the western walls across the square like long dark fingers, you climbed out of the hole for the last time that day and stood looking down at what you had done. The circle was now a pit, deep enough that you could no longer see the bottom clearly from where you stood, only the dark brown of the clay and the faint gleam of the iron bar that you had left leaning against the wall inside. Tomorrow you would lower yourself back in and continue the work, deepening the shaft until it reached the cool, damp strata where the water hid. But for now, the hole was enough. A beginning made, a circle broken, and a path started down into the earth. You gathered your tools, wiped the soil from the blade of the bar with a handful of dry grass, coiled the rope once more, and stacked everything neatly beside the spoils pile. The square was quiet. The village settled into the slow rhythm of evening, and the sky above was beginning to show the first hints of color, a pale gold at the horizon that would deepen into orange and then fade to gray as the night came on. You turned away from the hole and walked back through the lanes to your house, your feet leaving soft prints in the dust that would be gone by morning, blown away or walked over or simply absorbed back into the dry, waiting earth. The circle you had broken open the day before waited for you in the early light, its raw edges pale against the darker, unbroken ground of the village square. You stood at its rim as the sun lifted itself above the thatched roofs, holding a wooden peg in one hand and a length of knotted string in the other, the tools for making the work true. The morning was already warm despite the hour, the air heavy with the smell of dust and the faint, distant memory of smoke from a cook fire that had been cold for days. You knelt beside the shallow pit and placed the peg at the center point you had marked with a small stone the evening before, driving it into the hard earth with 2 firm taps from the heel of your hand until it stood upright and steady. The string uncoiled from around your fingers with a soft whisper. Its length measured the day before against the radius you had chosen, a distance of 2 feet and 3 inches from the center peg to the outer edge. You had settled on this measurement not by calculation on paper, but by standing in the square and imagining the space a man would need to swing a pick without striking his elbows against clay walls, a space wide enough for the bucket to pass freely, but narrow enough to keep the earth from collapsing under its own dry weight. You tied a small loop at the end of the string and slipped it over the peg, then stretched the line taut, walking slowly around the center point while holding a sharpened stick in your other hand, its tip tracing a faint groove in the soil. The groove was barely visible at first, a thin line of disturbance in the dust, but you walked the circle 3 times to deepen it, each circuit identical to the one before, your feet falling in the same tracks until a clear boundary ringed the center peg like the rim of a wheel. When you had finished marking the circumference, you stood back and looked at the circle from several angles, checking for any deviation that your eye might catch. The shape was true enough for the purpose, not perfect, but close, a guide that would keep the walls of the shaft straight as you descended. You removed the center peg and coiled the string around it again, placing it on the ground beside the other tools where it would wait until needed once more at a deeper level. The work of measuring was small and quiet, taking no more time than the slow walk of the sun up the pale dome of the sky, and when it was done, you felt no particular sense of accomplishment, only the calm recognition that the next stage could now begin. You lowered yourself into the shallow excavation, the floor of the pit now reaching just below your knees when you stood inside it. The walls around you showed the 3 layers you had uncovered the day before, the thin grey dust of the surface, then the brown loam that had once held roots and worms and the busy life of the soil, and finally the yellow clay that extended downward into depths you could not yet see. All 3 were dry in a way that went beyond the absence of water, dry in the manner of things that had forgotten moisture entirely. You picked up the short-handled mattock that leaned against the wall and examined its blade, a curved piece of iron worn thin at the edge by years of striking Saxony's stubborn ground. The wooden handle was smooth in your grip, polished by the oils of your hands over many seasons, and it fit your palm with the familiarity of a thing used so often it had become an extension of the arm. The first swing was not a violent motion, but a controlled arc that brought the blade down at an angle into the clay wall where the circle's boundary had been marked. The iron bit into the packed earth with a soft, dull thud, a sound that did not carry far beyond the rim of the hole, swallowed by the stillness of the morning. You pulled back, loosening a chunk of clay that crumbled away from the wall and fell onto the floor at your feet, and you repeated the motion again, finding the same rhythm you had found 1,000 times before in other holes, other villages, other summers, just as dry as this one. The mattock rose and fell in a slow, steady beat, each strike placed carefully along the edge of the marked lime, widening the shaft downward by small increments, an inch or 2 of material removed with each pass. The clay yielded reluctantly, as clay always does when it has been baked by months of sun and no rain. Its texture under the blade was crumbly rather than plastic, breaking into angular fragments instead of peeling away in smooth slices. You gathered these fragments with your bare hands, scooping them into the leather bucket that sat beside you, and the feel of the soil told you more than your eyes could see. The clay was not uniform. It contained small flecks of darker material, ancient organic matter that had been trapped in the sediment long ago when this ground was not ground at all but the bed of a shallow sea, and tiny pebbles of quartz that glinted faintly in the dim light from above when you turned them over in your palm. You picked out these stones one by one, setting them aside in a small pile by the rim because they were of no use in the well and would only dull the blade if struck again. The bucket filled slowly, each load requiring dozens of strikes with the mattock and many handfuls of crumbled earth. When it was full enough that the weight began to strain your arms, you lifted it with both hands and raised it to the rim of the hole, setting it on the flat ground above with a careful placement that kept it from tipping. Then you climbed out using the shallow steps you had cut into one wall, your feet finding the footholds without thought, your body remembering the way out even as your mind drifted elsewhere, following the quiet, empty paths that open when the work is repetitive and the world is still. Above ground, the heat was more noticeable, pressing against your face and neck as you straightened up and lifted the bucket. You carried it to the spoils pile at the edge of the square, a low mound that had grown slightly since the previous evening, and upended the contents onto the crest. The clay fell in a dusty cascade, small chunks tumbling down the slope to join the other fragments of the earth you had removed. The pile was the same color as the ground it came from, a pale yellowish brown that caught the morning light without reflecting it, absorbing the brightness into a flat, matte surface. You stood for a moment looking at the mound, noting how it had grown, noting too that the hole from which it came was still so shallow that the pile seemed almost comically small beside it. But the work was not about the size of the pile. It was about the depth of the hole, and depth came only with time and repetition. You returned to the pit with the empty bucket and lowered yourself back inside, the temperature dropping by several degrees as you descended below ground level. The walls around you were now tall enough to block the direct light from the low sun, casting the floor into a soft brown shadow that made the colors of the clay seem richer and deeper. You picked up the mattock again and moved to a new section of the circle, one you had not yet touched, and resumed the same motion: lift, swing, strike, pull back, scoop, place in bucket. The rhythm was the only clock you needed, marking the passage of the morning in small accumulations of loosened earth. After some time, you paused to examine the wall more closely. The act of digging had exposed a cross-section of the clay layer that was clean and vertical, showing subtle variations in color that you had not noticed before. Near the top, just below the loam, the clay was the pale yellow of dried corn husks, but a few inches deeper, it shifted to a slightly darker hue, more the color of mustard seeds than straw. This change was so gradual that you might have missed it if you had not stopped to look, and it meant nothing in particular. Not evidence of water nor warning of difficult ground, simply a record of the way the earth had settled over countless years. You touched the darker clay with your fingertip, pressing into its surface, and found it no more moist than the layer above, just a different shade of the same dryness. The work continued through the middle of the morning with no interruption, no event to mark 1 hour from the next except the slow climb of the sun and the corresponding shift of the shadow cast by the eastern wall of the hole. That shadow crept across the floor as you worked, a dark band that moved almost imperceptibly, and when it had reached the opposite side of the pit, you knew, without looking at the sky, that the morning was half spent. You climbed out again to empty the bucket, and this time when you stood above ground, you saw the old man had returned to his bench against the common house wall, his hands folded in his lap, in the same posture as yesterday, his eyes fixed on the same middle distance. He did not watch you work in the way a person watches something of interest. His gaze simply passed over the square and included you in its sweep without lingering. You nodded in his direction, a small acknowledgement that required no response, and he blinked slowly, the only sign that he had registered your presence. Back in the hole, you worked now on the floor itself, loosening the clay directly beneath your feet so that the entire shaft would descend at a uniform rate. This was more difficult because you could not stand fully upright and swing the mattock with the same freedom, so you knelt instead, using the tool with shorter, more controlled strokes. The position brought your face close to the earth, so close that you could see the tiny cracks that ran through the clay in all directions, a network of fine fissures caused by contraction in the heat. Some of these cracks were no wider than a hair, others wide enough to admit the tip of your smallest finger, and they extended downward into the floor, disappearing into depths you could not see. You wondered in a distant, unengaged way how far those cracks went, whether they reached all the way down to the water table if the drought was severe enough, but the wondering was idle and without urgency, the kind of thought that floats through a quiet mind without leaving any trace behind. By the time the sun stood directly overhead and the shadows had shrunk to narrow pools at the base of the buildings, you had deepened the shaft by another 8 inches across its entire width. The walls were straight and clean, showing the careful work of your mattock in the pattern of small gouges that covered their surface. You climbed out and sat on the rim, your legs dangling into the hole, and ate a piece of bread with a small wedge of hard cheese that had softened slightly in the heat. The bread was dry and crumbly, the cheese salty and sharp, and you chewed them together slowly, letting the flavors mingle on your tongue. The water in your leather skin was warm again, but it washed the meal down and left your mouth clean. You looked across the square while you ate, seeing the village in its midday stillness. A woman crossed from one house to another carrying a clay pot balanced on her hip, her steps slow and careful in the heat. A dog lay in the thin shade of a wall, its sides rising and falling with shallow breaths, too tired even to pant. The leaves on the single linden tree near the churchyard wall hung limp and dull, their edges curled inward as if trying to hide from the sun. Everything was still, everything was quiet, and the world seemed to be holding its breath and waiting for something that would not come, the rain that the sky had forgotten how to make. When the meal was done, you rested for a few minutes longer, letting the warmth of the sun soak into your shoulders and back, before lowering yourself into the hole once more. The afternoon work was the same as the morning work, the same motions repeated in the same order, the same quiet sounds of iron on clay, and the soft rustle of earth falling into the bucket. The depth increased by inches, slow inches that accumulated without fanfare, and the pile of spoil beside the square grew a little taller, a little wider, its shape shifting as each new load was added to its crest. At one point, digging near the center of the floor, you uncovered something that was not clay. It was a stone, larger than the pebbles you had been picking out, roughly the size of your 2 fists held together. You had felt the mattock strike it with a different note, a sharper, higher sound that told you immediately what you had found. You set the tool aside and dug around the stone with your fingers, loosening the clay that held it in place, and after several minutes of patient work, you were able to pry it free and lift it out. It was a piece of grey granite, water-worn and smooth on one side, rough and angular on the other where it had been broken from some larger mass long ago. How it had come to rest here 20 inches beneath the surface of a Saxon village square, you could not know. It had been carried by ice or water in some distant age, then buried by the slow accumulation of time and sediment, until your mattock found it in the summer of 1540. You turned it over in your hands, feeling its weight and the cool smoothness of its worn face, then set it on the rim of the hole to be removed later with the other stones. The afternoon wore on, the heat building to its peak and then beginning very slowly to ease as the sun slid past its zenith and started its long descent toward the western horizon. You worked steadily, not pushing yourself beyond the pace you could sustain, because the well would not be dug in a day, or a week, or even a month, and there was no point in spending your strength before it was needed. The deeper you went, the harder the clay became, compacted by the weight of all the earth above it. But the mattock was sharp and your arms were strong, and the wall of the shaft continued its slow retreat downward. When the light began to change, taking on the faint golden quality that marked the approach of evening, you decided that the day's work was complete. You climbed out for the last time and stood beside the hole, looking down into the shadowed interior. The shaft was now deep enough that you could no longer see the floor clearly from this angle, only the dark walls descending into dimness, their surface marked by the regular pattern of your mattock strokes. At a guess, you had reached a depth of perhaps 3.5 feet below the original surface. Not deep by the standards of a finished well, but a solid beginning, a foundation that would support the deeper work to come. You gathered your tools, wiping the blade of the mattock with a handful of dry grass to remove the clay that clung to the iron. The bucket you emptied of its last partial load, adding it to the spoils pile with the rest. Then you arranged everything in the neat row beside the hole, ready for the morning, and placed a flat board over the opening to keep any stray animal from falling in during the night. The board was heavy, rough sawn oak, and it fit across the rim with a few inches to spare on each side. You laid it down carefully, listening to the solid thud as it settled into place, and the hole was closed until tomorrow. The walk back through the village was slow, your legs heavy with the accumulated weariness of the day's work. The lane was empty now. The doors of the houses closed against the lingering heat, and the only movement was a thin column of pale smoke rising from one of the chimneys far down the row, someone cooking the evening meal over a small, reluctant fire. You reached your own house and went inside, where the air was still warm but shaded, the thick walls holding back the worst of the day's heat. You washed your hands and face slowly, pouring a small amount of water from the clay jug into a wooden bowl and letting it run over your skin, feeling the grit of the clay wash away and the coolness of the water, brief as it was, against your cheeks. Then you sat by the window that was no window, only the oiled cloth glowing faintly with the last light of the day, and you did nothing. The world outside was quiet, the village settling into the long evening, and inside your mind there was only the memory of the day's rhythm, the lift and fall of the mattock, the soft sound of earth falling into the bucket, the slow descent into the dry, patient ground. Tomorrow would be the same, and the day after that, and the day after that, until the hole was deep enough and the water came. But for now, the evening was enough, and you let it be enough, sitting in the warm silence as the light faded slowly from gold to grey to the deep blue of a Saxon summer night. On the third morning of the work, you lowered yourself into the shaft and found that the rim of the hole now stood level with your eyes. This change had come so gradually over the previous days that you had not marked the exact moment when the ground outside rose above your head. But now, standing on the clay floor with the walls enclosing you on all sides, you understood that the well had truly begun. The world above had shrunk to a circle of pale sky, a bright disk of washed-out blue and white that seemed smaller than it ought to be, framed by the straight edges of the excavation you had made with your own hands. You looked up at that circle for a long moment, seeing nothing else. No roofs or trees or faces, only the empty dome of the Drought sky, and the faint shimmer of heat already beginning to dance above the rim, despite the early hour. The bucket and mattock waited where you had left them the evening before, leaning against the wall that faced the sunrise. You picked up the mattock first, its handle still cool from the night, and ran your thumb along the edge of the blade to check for any dulling that might have occurred. The iron was sound, the edge holding well against the abrasive clay, and you set it back against the wall while you turned your attention to the walls themselves. In the lower half of the shaft, where the yellow clay gave way to the darker mustard-colored layer you had noticed the previous day, the surface was clean and vertical, showing the regular pattern of your mattock strokes like the grain of cut wood. Higher up, near the rim, the walls were lighter in color, the pale ochre of the upper clay mixed with streaks of brown from the thin loam layer. This was the section you would widen today, bringing the upper shaft into alignment with the slightly narrower diameter you planned for the deeper levels. A common practice among well diggers meant to provide a stable shoulder for the stone lining that would come much later. You began the widening work at the eastern wall, where the morning light angled down into the shaft most directly, illuminating the clay with a soft, diffuse glow. The mattock rose and fell in that same unhurried rhythm that had become the measure of your days, each stroke peeling away a thin slice of the dry earth. Because you were working above your own head level now, you had to adjust your stance, standing with your feet planted wide and your body braced against the opposite wall, your arms reaching upward to guide the blade along the marked line. The position was slightly awkward at first, requiring muscles you had not used in the lower digging, but after the first dozen strokes your body remembered the shape of this work and settled into it, finding the balance and the angle that let the tool do most of the labor. The clay that fell from these higher sections landed on your shoulders and in your hair, a fine, dry powder that sifted down with each impact of the mattock. You did not mind this. It was part of the work, as familiar as the weight of the tool in your hands, and you would brush it away later when you climbed out for water and rest. For now, you simply let the dust settle where it would, a patina of pale earth that covered your arms and the front of your tunic, marking you as a creature of the hole, a digger who belonged more to the ground than to the open air. The work of widening required a different kind of attention than the straightforward deepening of the floor. You had to check the line frequently, pausing after every few strokes to sight along the wall and ensure that you were not cutting too deeply or leaving bulges that would catch the bucket as it rose and fell. The string and peg sat on the floor beside you, and twice during the morning you uncoiled the string and stretched it from the center point to the wall, measuring the radius to confirm that the shaft was remaining true. Both times the measurement showed a circle that was nearly perfect, deviating by no more than the width of your thumb in a few small places, deviations that you corrected with careful, shallow strokes of the mattock until the wall was smooth and even. The morning passed without incident, marked only by the slow migration of the circle of sky from a position almost directly overhead to a spot slightly westward as the sun climbed and began its descent toward afternoon. You emptied the bucket many times, each load consisting of the crumbled clay from the widened sections and the deeper material you continued to remove from the floor in alternating periods of work. The spiles pile beside the square grew higher and wider, its slopes taking on a distinct shape that you could see whenever you climbed out and straightened your back before returning to the hole. From above, the pile was a pale mound against the darker earth of the square, a marker of your progress that anyone passing by could read at a glance. It was during one of these trips above ground, near what you judged to be midday, that you noticed the old man on the bench was not alone. Another villager had joined him, a woman of middle years whose face you recognized, but whose name you did not know, or had known once and forgotten in the long quiet of the drought. She sat at the far end of the bench, her hands busy with a small piece of mending, a torn shirt or apron that she worked with a bone needle and coarse thread. Neither of them spoke to you as you emptied the bucket, and you did not speak to them. The silence of the square had become a kind of language in itself, a shared understanding that words were too heavy for the heat, that the simple presence of other people was enough and more would be too much. You nodded once in their general direction, a gesture that asked for nothing and offered nothing, and returned to the hole with the empty bucket bumping against your leg. Back in the shaft, you knelt near the center of the floor and examined a section of the clay that had been exposed only that morning. Here, at a depth that you estimated to be slightly more than 7 feet below the original surface, the color of the earth had changed again. The mustard halo of the upper clay had faded into something new, a shade that was difficult to name precisely in the dim light of the shaft. It was not brown, not grey, but something between the two, the color of a weathered wooden bucket that has held water for many years and absorbed a permanent stain of dampness. You scraped a small sample from the wall with the tip of the mattock and held it close to your face, turning it over in your palm. The texture was different as well, less crumbly than the upper layers, with a faint smoothness that suggested a higher content of fine silt. When you pressed it between your thumb and forefinger, it held together slightly longer before crumbling, a small but noticeable change from the instant disintegration of the surface clay. This was not water. You had dug wells before and knew the signs of approaching moisture, the coolness that rises from the floor, the dark gleam on the walls, the smell of wet earth that fills the shaft long before the first seep appears. None of those signs were present here. The walls were dry to the touch, the air in the shaft as warm and still as the air above, the only smell that of dust and your own sweat. The color change was merely a record of the Earth's deep history, a boundary between one ancient layer of sediment and another, placed here by forces that had nothing to do with the drought of 1540 or the needs of a Saxon village. You acknowledged this fact with a small internal nod and then set the sample aside, returning to the work of the mattock and the bucket and the slow, patient removal of the ground. The afternoon brought the fullest heat of the day, the sun standing directly over the shaft so that its light fell straight down onto the floor, illuminating every detail of the clay and the tools in your own dust-covered hands. In this light you could see things that the angled shadows of morning and evening hid, the tiny cracks that ran through the clay in a network finer than any spider's web, the small pebbles of quartz that glittered faintly when the light caught them just so, the subtle variations in color that marked the passage from one handful of earth to the next. You worked more slowly now, the heat pressing down on you even in the relative cool of the shaft, and you paused more often to wipe your forehead with your sleeve and to take small sips from the water skin that hung from a peg driven into the wall at shoulder height. The water was warm as it always was by this hour, but it wet your throat and cut the dust that had settled there from the clay you had disturbed. You drank sparingly, because the jug in the house held only so much, and the well was not yet deep enough to provide its own supply, and because drinking sparingly was a habit you had learned in other dry summers, other villages where the water had to be carried from distant streams or shared from dwindling cisterns. The thirst was not sharp or painful, merely a low, constant presence that you had long ago learned to ignore, like the weight of your own body or the sound of your own breath. In the middle of the afternoon, while you were working on a particularly stubborn section of the western wall, your mattock struck something that rang with a higher note than the dull thud of clay. You stopped and cleared away the loose material with your fingers, uncovering a stone much larger than any you had found so far. It was a boulder, really, a mass of grey granite that had been split in half long ago by frost or pressure, and its flat face was now embedded in the wall of the shaft at the level of your chest. You worked around it carefully, loosening the clay that held it in place, and after perhaps half an hour of patient excavation, you were able to pry it free. It fell to the floor with a heavy thud that vibrated up through the soles of your feet, and you knelt beside it, brushing away the last of the clinging earth to reveal its surface. The stone was interesting in a quiet, undemanding way. Its flat face was smooth and faintly polished, worn by water in some unimaginably distant past when this part of Saxony had been covered by a great sea or crossed by powerful rivers. Embedded in the grey matrix were smaller crystals of a darker mineral that caught the light and glittered faintly, and here and there were thin veins of white quartz that ran through the stone like the traces of old scars. You turned it over in your hands, feeling its considerable weight, and then set it on the floor near the wall where it would wait with the other stones you had collected. Later, when the well was finished, stones like this would be useful for lining the shaft or for building the rim that would keep people from falling in. For now, it was simply a thing you had found, a piece of the deep earth brought to light by your own labor and then set aside. The work continued, the afternoon wearing on toward evening with the same slow, steady rhythm. You widened the upper walls until they were straight and true from rim to floor, a uniform cylinder of excavated earth that descended 7 feet and some inches into the ground. When you stood in the center of the floor and looked up, the circle of sky above was perfectly framed by the walls you had cut, a bright disk that seemed very far away, though you knew it was only the height of a tall man standing on another man's shoulders. The perspective from the bottom of a well is a strange thing, a compression of the world into a single round window, and you stood for a long moment simply looking up at that window, watching the slow drift of a single wisp of high cloud that was too thin to hold any promise of rain. The climb out at the end of the day was becoming a more deliberate process. The walls were too high now to simply step up and over the rim, so you had cut a series of shallow footholds into one side of the shaft. Small notches, just deep enough to admit the toe of your boot. You used these now, placing your feet carefully and pushing upward with your hands braced against the opposite wall. A slow, methodical ascent that brought your head level with the rim, then your shoulders, then your entire body emerging into the open air of the square. The transition was always slightly disorienting, the sudden expansion of the world from a circle to a full horizon, the return of the village sounds and the distant shapes of roofs and trees and the low hills beyond. You stood beside the hole for a minute, letting your senses readjust, the warm evening air feeling almost cool against your skin after the still heat of the shaft. The spoils pile had grown significantly over the course of the day. You walked over to it and stood looking at the mound, noting its shape and size with the practiced eye of someone who measures progress in cubic feet of displaced earth. The pile was now perhaps waist-high at its crest, a low hill of pale clay and darker loam mixed with the grey dust of the surface. Small stones dotted its slopes, the larger rocks you had removed one by one over the past 3 days, and at the very top sat the halved granite boulder you had freed that afternoon, its smooth face catching the last light of the sun. You gathered your tools, wiping each one clean with a handful of dry grass before placing it in its proper spot. The mattock you laid flat on the ground beside the hole, its iron blade pointing away from the rim. The bucket you turned upside down to keep any stray dust or debris from settling inside overnight. The rope you coiled carefully, loop after loop, and hung from a peg you had driven into the wall of the nearest building. A small accommodation that the owner of the house had granted without being asked because a well was for everyone and everyone understood the work. The only tool you left in the shaft was the wooden ladder that you had lowered down earlier in the day. A simple construction of 2 long poles with short rungs lashed between them, its feet resting on the clay floor. Tomorrow you would need it to descend quickly and safely, now that the depth had passed the point where jumping down was wise. The square was quiet in the evening light, the bench against the common house wall empty now, its occupants gone inside to whatever small meals they would prepare from the dwindling stores of the Drought. You stood alone in the center of the village, the well hole dark at your feet, the pale spoils pile glowing softly in the dusk, and you felt a sense not of accomplishment but of simple continuation. The hole was deeper than it had been this morning, but it was not yet deep enough, and tomorrow the work would resume, the same motions in the same order, the same quiet sounds in the same enclosed space. This was the nature of well digging, a slow descent into the earth that could not be hurried and could not be changed, only continued until the water was reached or until the digger could go no deeper. You placed the heavy oak board over the mouth of the shaft and listened to the soft thud as it settled onto the rim, sealing the darkness below from the fading light above. Then you turned and walked back through the lanes to your house, your feet finding their way without thought along the path that had become as familiar as the handle of the mattock. The air was warm and still, carrying no scent of rain or change, only the dry smell of dust and old thatch and the faint distant odor of the shrunken river. You went inside and closed the door, and in the small dark room you sat on the edge of the bed and let the weariness of the day settle into your bones, a deep and quiet fatigue that asked for nothing but rest and promised nothing but another day of the same slow, patient work. The night outside was silent, no wind stirring the thatch, no animals moving in the lanes. The drought had taken even the night sounds, leaving only a profound stillness that seemed to press against the walls of the house. In that stillness you lay down and closed your eyes, and behind your eyelids you could still see the circle of sky and the dark walls of the shaft and the slow, steady fall of the mattock against the patient clay. The images faded slowly, dissolving into the deeper darkness of sleep, and you let them go, one by one, until there was nothing left but the quiet breathing of your own body and the long, empty hours of the Saxon night. The shaft had grown deep enough, somewhere past 8 feet as you measured it with your eye against the ladder rungs, that lifting the bucket by hand from the floor to the rim had become a labor in itself. Your arms ached at the end of each day, not from the digging, but from hauling load after load of clay and stone up the height of the hole, and you knew that the time had come to build the windlass. This was not a decision you made with any sense of urgency or accomplishment, but simply the next logical step in the progression of the work, the way a field must be ploughed before it can be sown, the way winter follows autumn without anyone needing to declare it. You had known from the first morning that the windlass would be required when the shaft passed the height of a tall man, and that moment had now arrived. The materials for the frame had been waiting behind your house since the spring, long before the drought had declared itself and before anyone had thought a new well would be needed. You kept a small supply of rough-hewn timbers under a lean-to, where the sun could not warp them too badly, and the rain, when there had been rain, could not soak them through. These were not fine pieces of wood. They were simple oak limbs and straight sections of trunk that had been shaped with a broad axe and left to season for a year or more, their bark peeled away and their ends squared just enough to join together. In the early light of the fourth morning you walked to this store of wood and stood before it, running your hands over the surfaces of the timbers to check for cracks or rot. The drought had been kind to wood if to nothing else, and the beams were sound, dry to the core, their grain tight and straight. You selected 4 pieces for the uprights, 2 long posts that would stand on opposite sides of the shaft to support the drum, and 2 shorter braces that would anchor the frame to the ground and keep it from shifting under the weight of the bucket. Each piece was heavy, and you carried them one at a time through the village lane to the square, your steps slow and measured under the burden. The old man on the bench watched you pass with the first post across your shoulder, his eyes following your progress without curiosity. And when you returned for the second post, he had shifted his gaze elsewhere, to the pale slope of the spoils pile or the blank sky. You could not tell which. Passers-by, of whom there were few at this hour, stepped aside to let you pass and said nothing, their faces drawn with the same patient acceptance that had settled over the entire village like a second skin. When all 4 uprights lay on the ground beside the hole, you returned once more to the lean-to and brought back a length of straight oak trunk that would serve as the drum. This piece was shorter than the others, perhaps 3 feet long and as thick as your thigh, its surface still rough with the marks of the broad axe that had shaped it, but essentially round, a cylinder that would turn smoothly enough if it were mounted true. You had used it once before, 2 summers past, when you helped dig a well in the neighboring village of Klipphausen, and it had served well there, its ends worn smooth by the rope that had wrapped around it for many weeks. You set it down with the other timbers and then stood back to survey the collection, 4 posts, 1 drum, and a coil of rope that already bore the dirt and wear of this new excavation. The neighbor you had worked with before, an older man named Stefan, whose face was as weathered as the wood you had carried, appeared at the edge of the square as you were sorting the timbers by length and purpose. He walked slowly, one hand pressed to the small of his back, where the years had settled into a permanent ache, and he carried under his other arm a leather pouch of wooden pegs and a small mallet of dense beechwood. You had not asked him to come, but he came anyway because the raising of a windlass was work that required 2 pairs of hands, and because in the life of the village certain tasks were understood to belong to everyone, even if only one person was named to do them. He set the pouch on the ground and straightened up slowly, his breath coming in a shallow sigh that was not complaint, but simply the sound of an old body moving after a night of rest. "Good morning," you said, the words flat and simple, carrying no more weight than the statement of a fact. "Morning," he replied, his voice soft and dry like leaves stirring on a branch. The posts looked straight enough. You nodded and knelt beside the longest pair, lifting one of them to examine its end. The broad axe had left a surface that was nearly flat, close enough to square that a joint could be cut into it without too much adjustment. Stefan knelt across from you, his knees cracking audibly as they touched the ground, and together you began the slow work of preparing the timbers for assembly. The first task was to cut mortises into the tops of the 2 main uprights, rectangular slots that would receive the ends of the drum axle. You marked the locations with a piece of charcoal pulled from the cold hearth at your house, measuring twice and then once more to be certain, because a windlass that was not level would bind against its bearings and make the work harder than it needed to be. Stefan held the posts steady while you worked with a narrow chisel and the beechwood mallet, the sharp iron biting into the dry oak with a crisp, clean sound that echoed softly off the walls of the surrounding houses. The mortise took shape slowly, its sides straight and its bottom flat, a cavity perhaps 3 inches deep and 2 inches wide that would cradle the squared end of the drum axle. You tested the fit frequently with a scrap of wood cut to the same dimension as the axle end, shaving away thin curls of oak until the scrap slid into the mortise with a gentle friction, neither loose nor tight. When the first mortise was finished, you turned the post around and cut an identical slot at the same height. The measurements transferred carefully with the charcoal and a straight-edged piece of string. The work was quiet and repetitive, the mallet striking the chisel in a slow rhythm that had no urgency, and the morning grew warm around you while you bent over the wood. The second upright received the same treatment, its mortises cut to match the first, and when both posts lay side by side on the ground, you could see that the slots aligned well enough. A slight variation in the depth of one mortise was corrected with 2 gentle taps of the chisel, and then the uprights were ready. Stefan straightened up and pressed his palm against his lower back, his eyes squinting against the brightness of the sky, and you both stood for a moment without speaking, letting the small satisfaction of the finished work settle into the quiet of the square. The drum itself needed attention next. The ends had been roughly squared long ago, but were now splintered and worn from their previous use, and you set about trimming them clean with a small hand axe, shaving away the damaged wood until the surfaces were smooth and true. The diameter of the squared ends had to be slightly smaller than the mortises to allow for free turning, and you measured this difference with your eye and your thumb, not with any marked rule, but with the accumulated judgment of hands that had done such work many times before. When the ends fit into the mortises with a small amount of play, neither binding nor wobbling, you set the drum aside and turned your attention to the braces. The shorter posts would be driven into the ground on either side of the shaft, leaning outward at a slight angle to brace the main uprights against the inward pull of the loaded bucket. You had chosen posts of red beech for this purpose, a wood that was dense and strong and resisted splitting even when driven hard. With Stefan holding each brace in position, you sighted along its length to check the angle, adjusting the placement until the line felt right to your eye. Then you took up a heavy wooden maul, its head a solid block of elm bound with iron bands, and began to drive the first brace into the earth. The ground was hard from the drought, packed and resistant, and the maul fell with a dull, heavy thud that reverberated up through the handle and into your arms. Each blow drove the post a fraction of an inch deeper, the dry clay gripping its sides as if reluctant to let it pass. You worked in a steady rhythm, pausing occasionally to check that the post remained straight, and after some time the brace stood firm, buried to a depth of 2 feet, and as solid as the ground itself. The second brace went in beside it, angled to meet the first main upright, and then the process was repeated on the opposite side of the shaft. By the time all 4 braces were driven and the 2 main uprights were raised into position, leaning slightly inward against each other where they met above the hole, the sun had climbed past its midpoint, and the square was flooded with the flat white light of early afternoon. You and Stefan worked without speaking except for the necessary words. Hold here, lift now, a little more to the left. The silence between you was comfortable. The silence of 2 people who understood the work and had no need to fill the air with talk. The critical moment came when you lifted the drum and fitted its squared ends into the waiting mortises. Stefan stood on one side of the shaft and you on the other, and together you raised the heavy cylinder, guiding it carefully until the ends found their slots and settled into place with a soft, solid clunk. You stepped back and turned the drum slowly with your hand, watching the ends rotate in their bearings. The movement was smooth, a little stiff from the newness of the contact, but free enough that a bucket of clay would turn it without excessive effort. You nodded once, and Stefan nodded back, and that was all the acknowledgement the moment required. What remained now was the rope and the bucket and the handle that would turn the drum. You took the coil of hemp rope that had been lying in the shade of the common house wall and unrolled a length of it, enough to reach from the windlass drum down to the floor of the shaft and back up again with several feet to spare. One end you tied securely to the iron ring on the bucket's bail, a knot you had learned in childhood and had never forgotten, a knot that would hold fast under any weight the bucket could carry. The other end you brought to the drum, And here Stefan held the bucket suspended over the mouth of the shaft, while you wrapped the rope 3 times around the center of the cylinder and secured the free end to a small iron staple driven into the wood. The wraps gave the rope purchase against the smooth oak, preventing it from slipping when the bucket was heavy with spoil. The handle was the last piece. You had brought from the lean-to a length of curved iron rod, one end bent into a crank and the other flattened and pierced with a hole for a wooden peg. This you fitted into a square socket that had been cut into one end of the drum long ago, driving it home with the heel of your hand and then fixing it in place with a peg of hard ash tapped through the aligned holes. When you stood beside the windlass and grasped the iron handle, turning it slowly, the drum rotated and the rope wound cleanly around its middle, the bucket rising smoothly from the floor of the shaft where Stefan had lowered it moments before. The mechanism worked exactly as it should, simple and sturdy and silent except for the soft creak of the wood and the whisper of the hemp against itself. Stefan stepped back and looked at the completed windlass, his hands resting on his hips and his breath coming a little short from the effort of the afternoon. "It will serve," he said, the words falling into the quiet of the square with the same weight as the earlier silence. You nodded and turned the handle once more, watching the bucket descend into the darkness of the shaft until the rope went slack and you knew it had touched the clay floor. Then you reversed the motion and brought it back up, listening to the steady sound of the mechanism, a low rhythmic creaking that would become the soundtrack of the days ahead. The sound was not unpleasant. It was the sound of work proceeding as it should, the sound of a tool doing what it had been made to do. The afternoon had grown late while you were absorbed in the assembly, the shadows stretching long and blue across the square from the western buildings. Stefan gathered his mallet and the pouch of pegs, now nearly empty, and gave you a single nod that meant both farewell and acknowledgement of a job done. He turned and walked back the way he had come, his steps slow and careful on the uneven ground, and you watched him go until he disappeared around the corner of the common house. Then you were alone again with the windlass and the hole, and the pale mound of spoil that seemed to glow in the angled light. You spent the remaining time before evening testing the windlass with small loads, lowering the empty bucket and raising it again, checking for any binding in the bearings or slipping of the rope. Once you found a rough spot on the drum where a splinter had lifted, and you shaved it smooth with the edge of your chisel, the thin curl of oak falling to the ground at your feet. Another time you noticed that the upright on the eastern side had shifted slightly, perhaps a quarter of an inch, under the tension of the first few turns. You fetched the maul and drove the brace a little deeper, then reset the post until it stood plumb again. These small adjustments occupied you without hurry, each one performed with the same patient attention you gave to the digging itself, because a windlass that was not right would make every bucket of clay harder to raise and every hour in the shaft longer than it needed to be. When you were satisfied, you stood back and looked at the frame silhouetted against the pale evening sky. The 2 uprights rose from the ground like the ribs of some ancient animal, their tops meeting above the dark circle of the shaft, and between them hung the drum with its 3 turns of rope, descending into the invisible depths. The iron handle caught the last light and threw a small gleam across the square, a tiny point of brightness in the gathering dusk. The whole construction was simple and even crude by the standards of a millwright or a master carpenter, but it was strong and true, and it would do the work it was asked to do for as long as the well required. You placed the oak board over the mouth of the shaft as you did every evening, fitting it carefully between the uprights so that the windlass stood guard over the covered hole like a sentinel. The bucket you left hanging from the drum, suspended a few feet below the rim, where it would stay clean and ready for the morning. The rope you checked one final time, running your hand along its length where it wrapped around the drum and finding it sound. Then you coiled the excess neatly on the ground beside the left upright where it would not tangle underfoot. The square was empty in the fading light. The village settled into the quiet of evening meals and the long, slow descent toward night. You turned away from the windlass and began the short walk home, your body tired in a way that was different from the fatigue of digging, a tiredness that came from lifting and fitting and measuring and adjusting, the fatigue of careful assembly rather than brute removal. Your hands bore the marks of the work, small splinters of oak embedded in the pads of your palms, and the faint ache of gripping the maul and the chisel for hours. You would pick out the splinters later, sitting by the cold hearth with a sewing needle and the last of the daylight, a small ritual that closed each day of building. The door of your house closed behind you with a soft click, and you stood for a moment in the dim interior, letting your eyes adjust to the deeper darkness. The water jug sat in its corner, and you poured a small amount into a wooden cup, drinking it slowly while you leaned against the wall. The water was warm and tasted of clay, but it cut the dust in your throat and left you feeling clean in some small way. You sat on the edge of the bed and worked the splinters from your hands one by one, each one a tiny point of discomfort that yielded to the needle and then was gone. The light through the oiled cloth window faded from grey to deep blue to black, and when the last splinter had been removed, you lay back on the straw mattress and closed your eyes. Outside, the windlass stood silent over the covered hole, its frame dark against the stars that had begun to emerge in the drought-clear sky. Tomorrow you would take the handle in your hands again, and begin the long work of turning the drum, raising bucket after bucket of dry clay from the deepening shaft. But for now the windlass rested, its timbers settling into their new positions, adjusting to the weight they would bear in the days ahead. And in the small house at the edge of the village, you let the quiet of the night wash over you, carrying you slowly down into sleep, where there were no wells to dig and no windlasses to turn, only the endless, patient dark. The morning you first ascended into the shaft with the windlass standing ready above you, the air at the rim was already warm and heavy with the promise of another cloudless day. You placed your hands on the wooden frame, checking once more that the uprights had not shifted overnight, that the drum turned freely in its mortices, that the rope lay smooth and untangled around the barrel. The oak board you had placed over the mouth of the hole came away easily, and you set it aside against the nearest upright, where it would wait for evening. Looking down into the shaft from above, you could see the circle of clay at the bottom, a pale disk that seemed smaller than it should be, compressed by the depth into a distant target for the bucket's descent. Stefan arrived as you were coiling the rope into the bucket, preparing for the first load of the day. He walked with the same slow, careful gait as before, his hand pressed to his back, and he carried nothing but himself and the patience that came from decades of work like this. You had spoken briefly the previous evening about the new arrangement. He would stay above ground, turning the windlass handle and emptying the bucket onto the spoils pile, while you remained in the shaft to fill the bucket and guide its ascent. The arrangement made sense. He was too old for the climbing and the cramped labor of the hole, and you were young enough to endure the close darkness for hours at a stretch. It was a division of work that required no negotiation, only the quiet acknowledgement of each other's capacities. You lowered yourself into the shaft using the wooden ladder, your feet finding the rungs by feel more than sight, because the light from above did not penetrate far into the depths. The temperature changed as you descended, a gradual cooling that was noticeable first on your face and hands, then on your arms, as you passed below the level where the morning sun could reach. By the time your feet touched the clay floor, perhaps 12 feet below the surface of the square, the air was distinctly cooler than the air above. Not cold, but comfortably neutral, as if you had stepped into a room that had been shaded for many days. The walls around you were close, the circle of the shaft just wide enough to allow you to stand with your arms extended without touching the opposite sides, and the floor was the same pale, mustard-tinged clay you had been excavating, marked by the footprints of your previous days. You called up to Stefan, your voice sounding strange and flattened in the enclosed space, a single word to let him know you were ready. The rope above you tightened, the bucket rising from where you had left it hanging the night before, and then it began its descent toward you, turning slowly at the end of the line. You watched it come, a dark shape against the circle of brightness high above, growing larger and more distinct as it approached. When it reached your hands, you guided it to the floor and held it steady, while you began to fill it with the loose clay that lay around your feet, the spoil from the previous day's final loosening that you had not bothered to haul up before stopping. The first bucket of the morning filled quickly, the dry earth scooping easily into the leather vessel. You tapped the side of the bucket with the handle of the mattock, a signal to Stefan that the load was ready, and then you stepped back and watched the rope go taut and the bucket begin its slow ascent. The windlass creaked above you, a sound that was distant and rhythmic, the wood and hemp working together to lift the weight of the clay. You stood in the bottom of the shaft and listened. The creak of the drum, the faint scrape of the bucket against the wall where it brushed the clay, Stefan's footsteps on the hard ground above as he walked the bucket to the spoils pile. The sounds were muted by the depth, softened and made gentle by the earth that surrounded you, and they formed a kind of music that had no melody, but a steady, unhurried pulse. While you waited for the bucket to return, you did nothing. This was a new aspect of the work, this waiting, and it required a different kind of attention than the active labor of digging. You could not hurry the bucket's return. It would come when Stemp had emptied it and turned the handle the other way, and no amount of impatience would speed that process. So you stood in the dim light and let your eyes wander over the walls of the shaft, tracing the layers you had exposed over the past days. The upper portion, near the rim, was the pale yellow clay mixed with streaks of brown loam, the surface that had once grown grass and supported the feet of villagers. Below that, the darker mustard-colored clay extended downward for several feet, its surface marked by the regular gouges of your mattock. And here, at the bottom, a new layer was beginning to reveal itself as you dug deeper, a stratum of compacted material that contained more silt and fewer stones, its color shifting toward a grey-brown that reminded you of old wood ash. The wall directly in front of you, at the level of your chest, showed a particularly clear cross-section of this transition. You leaned close to it, close enough that you could see the individual grains of the sediment, the tiny sparkling flecks of mica that caught the faint light from above and glittered once before fading. There were small stones embedded in this layer too, most of them rounded and smooth, the kind of stones that are found in the beds of streams. But this stream had not flowed for a very long time, perhaps thousands of years or more, and its bed was now buried 12 feet beneath a Saxon village square. You pressed your thumb against one of the stones, feeling its cool, solid presence in the matrix of clay, and wondered in an idle, unengaged way about the water that had once moved over it, the current that had tumbled it smooth, and then left it here to be covered by the slow accumulation of ages. The bucket returned, descending through the column of dim air with a soft rustling sound, and you guided it to the floor again. The work resumed. Fill the bucket with the mattock, loosened clay, tap the signal, watch it rise into the light, wait in the silence. This was the rhythm that would govern the next many days, a pattern of active labor and patient stillness that repeated itself over and over without variation. The waiting periods were not empty. They were filled with the quiet observation of the walls and the floor and the small discoveries that the earth yielded as you went deeper. One such discovery came in the middle of the morning, after perhaps a dozen buckets had been raised and emptied. You were scraping the floor level with the blade of the mattock when you uncovered a flat, circular object that at first you took for another stone. But when you picked it up and brushed the clay from its surface, you saw that it was different. It was a fossil, a shell of some ancient creature that had lived in the sea that once covered this land. The shell was about the size of a small coin, its surface marked with fine ridges that radiated from a central point, and it was made of a material that gleamed dully in the faint light, a kind of stone that had once been living tissue. You turned it over in your palm, feeling its weight and the smooth curve of its shape, and then you set it carefully on a small ledge you had cut into the wall for just such finds. It joined the other small curiosities you had collected, the water-worn granite pebbles, the piece of quartz that sparkled when the light hit it just so, the fragment of what might have been petrified wood. These objects had no use, but they were interesting in a quiet, undemanding way, and looking at them during the waiting periods gave your eyes somewhere to rest. The temperature in the shaft remained constant and cool, a small mercy in the long drought summer. Above you, at the rim of the hole, the heat would be building to its daily peak, the sun beating down on the square and the thatched roofs and the dry, cracked earth of the village. But down here, 12 feet below the surface, you were insulated from that heat by the mass of the surrounding clay, and the air that touched your skin was neutral and still. You could feel the difference most clearly when you stood directly beneath the opening and looked up. A column of warmer air descended from above, a faint breath of the oven, like world outside, but it dissipated quickly and did not reach the floor. The well shaft was its own small climate, a pocket of coolness in the baked landscape of Saxony. The waiting periods grew longer as the day progressed, because Stefan above was tiring in the heat, and his turns of the windlass became slower. You did not mind the longer waits. They gave you more time to examine the walls and to feel the quiet of the deep earth pressing in around you. There was a particular quality to the silence of this depth, A silence that was not simply the absence of sound, but a positive presence. A weight that settled over your ears and muffled even the small noises of your own breathing. When you stood perfectly still, holding your breath for a moment, you could hear nothing at all except the faint, distant creak of the windlass far above and the soft rustle of the rope against the rim. And when those sounds paused, while Stefan emptied the bucket or rested his hands on his knees, the silence was absolute. A deep and ancient quiet that had not been disturbed for millennia until your mattock broke the clay. You ate your midday meal sitting on the floor of the shaft, your back against the cool wall and the bucket upturned beside you as a small table. The bread was the same hard, dark rye you had eaten for days, and the cheese was the same hard wedge. But in the dimness of the whole, the food tasted different, somehow simpler and more essential. You chewed slowly, listening to the faint sounds of Stefan eating his own meal somewhere above, the occasional cough or the scrape of his boot on the ground. The circle of sky overhead was a brilliant white disk, too bright to look at directly, and you watched it from the corner of your eye while you ate, noting the slow drift of a high, thin cloud that was too insubstantial to cast any shadow. After the meal, you resumed the work with a small adjustment to the rhythm. The floor had become uneven from the repeated filling of the bucket in the same spot, so you spent a period of time leveling it with careful strokes of the mattock, shaving away the high points and filling the low spots with the loose clay. A level floor was important for the stability of the ladder and for your own footing as you moved around the confined space, and the act of creating that level surface was satisfying in a quiet, methodical way. You worked slowly, checking the flatness with the straight edge of the mattock handle and adjusting as needed, until the entire circular floor was smooth and even. The afternoon brought a slight change in the light. The sun had moved far enough to the west that its direct rays no longer fell straight down the shaft. Instead, the light that reached you was reflected from the upper walls and the rim, a softer, more diffuse illumination that made the colors of the clay seem richer and deeper. The grey-brown layer you were now excavating took on a warm, almost amber tone in this indirect light, and the small stones embedded in its surface cast tiny shadows that gave the wall a textured, granular appearance. You paused often to look at these details, letting your eyes trace the patterns of the sediment, the fine laminations that recorded the slow deposition of material over countless seasons. Each thin line represented a period of time, perhaps a year or a decade or a century, and together they formed a record that reached back far beyond any human memory. The fossil you had found earlier drew your gaze again during one of the longer waits. You picked it up from its ledge and held it close to your face, turning it to catch what little light there was. The ridges on its surface were perfectly preserved, each one distinct and sharp, and you could see where the original shell material had been replaced by minerals that had seeped through the sediment over eons. The creature that had made this shell had lived and died in a warm, shallow sea, and its remains had settled to the bottom and been buried, compressed, transformed into stone, and now, in the summer of 1540, your mattock had brought it back to the light, the first eyes to see it since it had sunk into the ancient mud. The thought was large and strange, but it passed through your mind without leaving any strong impression, just one more quiet observation among many. The work continued until the light from above began to fade, not because the sun had set, but because the angle had become too shallow to illuminate the depths. You called up to Stem that the day was done, and you heard his acknowledgement, a single grunt that carried down the shaft. The bucket descended one last time, empty, and you placed your tools inside it, the mattock, the small handpick, the leather pouch of stones and fossils. Then you climbed the ladder slowly, your legs heavy with the accumulated weariness of the day, and emerged into the warm evening air of the square. Stefan was already coiling the rope, his movements slow and careful, his face sheened with sweat from the hours of turning the windlass in the heat. You thanked him with a nod, and he returned the nod, and then he walked away toward his own house without speaking. You stood for a moment beside the windlass, looking down into the dark shaft and reviewing the day's progress in your mind. The spoils pile had grown by another layer, the fresh clay a slightly different color from the older material, a stripe of grey-brown atop the yellow. The depth of the shaft had increased by perhaps 18 inches, a good day's work, but not remarkable, simply another step in the long descent toward the water that still lay hidden somewhere below. You placed the oak board over the mouth of the shaft and gathered your personal things, the water skin now nearly empty, the cloth you used to wipe your face, the small pouch of fossils that you would examine later in the evening light. Then you walked home through the quiet lanes, the village settling into its nightly stillness, the Drought sky above fading from white to pale gold to the deep blue of another rainless evening. The coolness of the shaft stayed with you for a while, a memory on your skin, but the warm air of the surface gradually erased it, leaving only the tiredness and the quiet satisfaction of work done. Inside your house, you poured the last of the water into a bowl and washed your face and hands, watching the clay-stained water turn brown and then disappear into the cracks of the earthen floor. You ate a small supper of bread and dried meat, sitting by the cold hearth, and then you took out the pouch of fossils and laid them on the bench beside you. In the fading light from the oiled cloth window, you turned each one over, examining its shape and texture, and then you put them away again, saving them for no particular purpose except the small pleasure of finding them. Tomorrow you would descend again, deeper into the earth, and there would be more clay, more stones, perhaps more fossils, and the same slow, steady rhythm of digging and waiting, filling and emptying, the quiet work of a well-digger in the Drought summer of 1540. The night outside was silent, and you lay down on the straw mattress and closed your eyes. Behind your eyelids, you could still see the circle of sky and the layered walls of the shaft and the small perfect shell that had waited so long in the dark to be found. The images faded slowly, merging with the deeper darkness of sleep, and you let them go, sinking down into a rest that was as deep and quiet as the earth itself. The midday meal had come and gone, eaten in the cool dimness of the shaft, while the bucket hung motionless above you and Stefan's footsteps moved across the square overhead, carrying him to the shade of the common house wall. He had called down to you before he went, his voice a dry rustle in the column of still air, letting you know that he would rest for a while, that the heat above was too heavy for turning the windlass without pause. You had answered with a single word of acknowledgement, and then his footsteps had faded, leaving you alone at the bottom of the shaft with the silence and the clay walls and the small flame of the tallow lamp that sat on its ledge. The lamp was a simple thing, a shallow dish of clay filled with rendered animal fat, a twisted cord of flax fibre serving as the wick. You had lit it with a spark from the flint and steel you carried in a small pouch at your belt, a practiced motion that took only a moment, and now the flame burned steadily in the still air of the shaft. You watched it while you sat on the upturned bucket, your back resting against the cool wall, your legs stretched out before you across the smooth clay floor. The flame was small, no larger than the tip of your thumb, and it burned with a clear, yellow light that did not flicker or waver. In a space where no wind could reach, where the air itself seemed to have forgotten how to move, the flame stood as straight and steady as a painted line, consuming the tallow with a faint, clean hiss that was the only sound besides your own breathing. You had seen flames behave this way before, in other wells, other deep places where the earth held its breath. The steadiness of the light was a marker of the depth and the stillness, a sign that the shaft was properly sealed from the movements of the air above. If the flame had flickered or leaned to one side, it would have meant a draught, a connection to some void or fissure in the earth that might weaken the walls. But the flame stood true, and you were reassured in a quiet, unspoken way, the reassurance of a craftsman who reads the signs of his work without needing to name them. The bread you had brought down with you sat on your knee, a dark wedge of rye that was hard at the edges and only slightly softer at the center. You broke off a corner and placed it in your mouth, chewing slowly because there was no reason to hurry. The taste was familiar and faint, the sour tang of the rye grain and the grit of the millstone that had ground it, and it mingled with the faint animal scent of the burning tallow. Beside the bread lay a small piece of hard cheese, its surface dry and slightly crumbly, and a single pickled onion that you had taken from the clay pot in your house, a small luxury saved for the long afternoons. You ate the onion last, its sharp, vinegary bite cutting through the dryness of the bread and leaving your mouth clean and awake. The solitude of the shaft was different from the solitude of the open air. Above ground, even when you were alone in the square, you were surrounded by the evidence of other people, the houses with their closed doors and shuttered windows, the distant sounds of voices or the scrape of a tool, the knowledge that at any moment someone might walk around a corner and nod in your direction. But in the shaft, at a depth of now perhaps 14 feet, You were enclosed by earth on all sides, and the only evidence of the world above was the circle of pale sky high overhead, a disk of light that seemed impossibly distant and unreachable. The walls around you were the work of your own hands, the marks of your mattock written in the clay like a kind of script. And beyond those walls lay only the silent, undisturbed ground, extending downward and outward into depths you would never see. You had been sitting for some time when your eyes fell upon a section of the wall to your left, a place where the grey-brown clay of the current layer met the darker, more compacted material that lay just beneath it. The transition was marked by a thin band of a different color, something between rust and charcoal, a streak that ran horizontally around the entire circumference of the shaft like a painted line. You leaned closer to it, bringing the lamp from its ledge so that the light fell directly on the surface. The band was composed of tiny fragments, small black specks that glittered faintly in the flame, and when you scraped one loose with your fingernail and rubbed it between your fingers, it left a dark smear like soot. This was not soot. It was the remains of ancient organic matter, plants that had grown and died and been buried in some long-ago marsh, then compressed over millennia into this thin, dark seam. There was no water in this seam, no moisture at all. You touched it with the flat of your palm, pressing your hand against the cool, dry surface, and felt only the faint grittiness of the ancient carbon. The seam was a record, like the fossils and the layered sediment, of a world that had existed here before Saxony had a name, before the village had been built, before anyone had thought to dig a well in this particular square. It meant nothing for your work except that the ground was stable, and the digging would continue. But it was interesting to look at. A small window into a past so deep it could not be measured in years or even centuries. The lamp burned on, the tallow melting slowly in its dish, and you watched the level of the liquid fat decline by tiny increments, a measure of the time you spent sitting there. The flame consumed the wick at a steady rate, and every few minutes you would reach out with a thin twig and push the charred end of the flax a little farther into the pool of fuel, keeping the light even. This small task was the only action required of you during the rest period, and you performed it without thought, your hands moving in a rhythm that matched the slow pace of the afternoon. Above you, the circle of sky had shifted its color slightly as the sun moved westward, the brilliant white of midday softening into a paler, more golden tone. You could see this change even from the bottom of the shaft, because the light that reached you was reflected from the upper walls, and the quality of that reflection altered as the angle of the sun changed. A small cloud passed across the disk of sky, invisible from below except as a dimming of the light, a brief shadow that moved across the walls and then was gone. The cloud was thin and high and carried no rain, only the suggestion of moisture that would never reach the ground, and you watched its passing with the same detached interest you gave to the flame and the dark seam and the clay. The fossil you had found the previous day still sat on its ledge, the small, ridged shell that had once belonged to a creature of an ancient sea. You picked it up now and held it close to the lamp, turning it so that the light fell across its surface at different angles. The ridges caught the flame and threw tiny shadows, each one distinct and sharp, and the stone material of the fossil gleamed with a faint, waxy luster. You wondered, in the idle way that such thoughts came, what the creature had looked like when it was alive, what color its shell had been, what small, simple life it had lived in the warm waters of that vanished ocean. The wondering was not urgent. It was simply a way to occupy the quiet space of the waiting, a path for your mind to walk while your body rested against the cool wall. Time passed without measurement. You had no hourglass, no marked candle, no way to know how long you had been sitting except by the slow decline of the tallow in the lamp dish and the gradual shift of the light quality above. The rest period was not defined by a fixed duration, but by the needs of your body and the return of Stefan from his own rest in the shade. You would remain here until you felt ready to resume the work, or until the bucket descended with its silent message that the old man was back at the windlass and the afternoon's labor could begin again. There was no rush, no pressure, only the calm acceptance of the rhythm that governed the days. You finished the last of the bread and brushed the crumbs from your tunic, watching them fall to the clay floor and disappear into the dust that covered everything. The pickled onion had left a faint, pleasant sharpness in your mouth, and you took a small sip of water from the skin that hung on its peg, The liquid warm but still wet, still sufficient. The water skin was nearly empty now, its leather sides soft and slack, and you made a mental note to refill it from the jug in your house before the next morning. There was no well yet to provide fresh water, only the dwindling supply that everyone in the village measured and conserved with the same careful attention you gave to the tallow in the lamp. The walls of the shaft had become more varied as you descended. The upper layers were uniform, the yellow clay and the mustard-colored loam that had seemed to extend forever when you first broke through the surface. But here, at 14 feet, the earth was beginning to show its complexity. In addition to the dark seam of ancient carbon, there were thin bands of sandier material, layers that crumbled more easily under the mattock, and pockets of larger stones that had to be worked around with care. One such pocket was visible in the wall opposite where you sat, a cluster of rounded cobbles pressed tightly together in a matrix of grey silt. The stones were all about the size of a hen's egg, smooth and water-worn, and they reminded you of the riverbed that must have once flowed through this place, carrying stones from the distant mountains and depositing them here in the slow, patient work of current and time. You stood up after a while, your legs stiff from sitting on the upturned bucket, and stretched your arms above your head, feeling the pull of the muscles across your shoulders and back. The ceiling of the shaft was close, only a few inches above your upraised hands, and you could feel the rough texture of the clay where the mattock had last cut. You walked slowly around the perimeter of the floor, a distance of perhaps 12 paces for the full circuit, examining the walls as you went. The lamp in your hand cast moving shadows that danced across the surface, illuminating first one detail and then another, a small stone projecting from the clay, a fossil fragment too broken to identify, the fine hairline cracks that traced their way downward toward the floor. Everything was dry, everything was still, and the quiet of the deep earth pressed in around you like a held breath. You paused at a spot on the southern wall where a curious shape had caught your eye. It was a fossil different from the small shell you had found before, larger and more distinct, and you brought the lamp close to see it clearly. The object was embedded in the clay with only a portion of its surface exposed, but that portion showed a curved ribbed form that looked something like a coiled ram's horn or the spiral of a snail's house. You scraped gently at the surrounding clay with the tip of your knife, loosening the material that held it, and after several careful minutes you were able to work the fossil free. It came away in your hand, a complete and perfect spiral of stone, its surface marked with fine groove lines and its interior filled with the same grey clay that had surrounded it. This was a graphia, though you did not know that name. You knew it only as a devil's toenail, a common find in the fields and stream banks of Saxony, a curiosity that farmers turned up with their ploughs and children collected, to trade among themselves. But to find one at this depth, in a layer that had not seen the surface since before the first human foot trod this land, gave it a different kind of weight. You turned it over in your palm, feeling the cool, dense stone, and then you placed it on the ledge beside the smaller shell. The two fossils sat together now, companions in the dimness, relics of a world so old it made the drought of 1540 seem like the blink of an eye. The sound of footsteps returning reached you from above, faint and muffled by the depth, followed by the creak of the windlass as Stefan took his place at the handle. The rope went taut, and the bucket began its slow descent, turning slightly as it came, a dark shape that grew larger against the circle of sky. You watched it approach, and when it reached your hands you guided it to the floor and began to fill it with the loose clay that had accumulated while you rested. The afternoon's work had resumed. The same quiet rhythm of filling and signaling and watching the bucket rise, the same patient waiting in the cool dimness while Stefan turned the handle above. The rest period had done its work. Your arms felt lighter and your mind clearer, and the motions of the labor came easily, without the drag of fatigue. You worked steadily through the remainder of the afternoon, deepening the shaft by another layer of clay, uncovering more of the grey-brown sediment and the dark seam of ancient carbon that ran through it. The light from above continued its slow shift toward evening, the golden tone deepening to amber and then to the pale orange that meant the sun was nearing the horizon. The bucket rose and fell, the windlass creaked, and the spoils pile above grew a little taller, a little wider, its slopes catching the angled light and glowing with the warm colors of the dry, patient earth. When the light in the shaft had faded to the point where you could no longer see the details of the walls, You called up to Stem that the day was done. The last bucket descended empty, and you placed your tools inside, the mattock, the knife, the lamp with its pool of cooling tallow. Then you climbed the ladder slowly, rung by rung, emerging into the warm evening air of the square. The sky above was a deep, clear blue, streaked with bands of pink and gold at the western horizon, and the air smelled of dust and dry thatch and the faint, distant smoke of a cook fire. Saxon was coiling the rope, his face weary but calm, and you took the bucket from him and carried it to the spoils pile, upending the last few handfuls of clay onto the crest. Then you gathered your personal things, the water skin, the cloth, and the small pouch in which you had placed the two fossils. The graffia was a pleasing weight in your hand, and you wrapped it carefully in a scrap of cloth before tucking it into the pouch, where it would wait with the other small treasures from the deep earth. The walk home was slow, your legs heavy with the good tiredness of a day's work completed. The village was quiet in the evening, the doors closed, the benches empty, and the only sound was the soft crunch of your own footsteps in the dust. You went inside and set the fossils on the bench, then poured water from the jug and washed the clay from your face and hands. The water was warm but clean, and it ran brown into the cracks of the floor, disappearing into the same dry earth that you had spent the day excavating. You ate a simple supper and sat for a while in the fading light, looking at the graffia and the small ridged shell, thinking about the ancient sea that had once covered this land and the slow, patient work of time that had turned living creatures into stone. The thoughts were large and quiet, and they filled the evening with a calm, undemanding presence. Then you lay down on the straw mattress and closed your eyes, and the images of the day passed slowly through your mind: the steady flame of the lamp, the dark seam of carbon in the clay, the spiral of the fossil turning in your hand. Sleep came without hurry, a slow descent into darkness as deep and quiet as the shaft itself, and you let it take you, knowing that tomorrow the work would continue, the bucket would rise and fall, and the earth would yield its secrets one handful at a time. The afternoon had turned, the sun sliding past its highest point and beginning the long, slow fall toward the western hills. And with that turn, the light in the shaft began to change. You noticed it first as a subtle shift in the quality of the shadows on the eastern wall, a softening of their edges that made the gouges of your mattock appear less sharp, less distinct. The direct light that had fallen straight down the shaft during the morning and midday hours was gone now, blocked by the angle of the sun and the depth of the hole, and what remained was an indirect illumination, a glow that reflected from the upper walls and filtered down through the column of still air, like light passing through deep water. The circle of sky above was no longer the brilliant white disk of noon, but a paler, more muted oval that seemed somehow farther away than it had been, a distant window onto a world that was becoming separate from the one you inhabited at the bottom of the shaft. You had reached a new layer of earth in the past hour of digging, and it was different from the layers above in ways that you felt more than saw. The mattock struck the surface with a sound that was not the crisp, crumbly note of the upper clays, but a deeper, duller thud, a sound that seemed to be absorbed by the material rather than reflected from it. The blade bit into the ground with more resistance, requiring a firmer swing and a stronger pull to loosen the same amount of material. And when the earth came away, it did so in dense, compacted chunks that held their shape rather than crumbling into dust. This was glacial till, you knew without having to be told, a layer of material that had been ground and crushed and deposited by the great sheets of ice that had once covered this land, pressing down with unimaginable weight and leaving behind a matrix of clay and silt and stones, all fused together into a substance that was nearly as hard as the rock from which it came. The till was a good sign for a well digger, though not in the way that water was a good sign. It meant that the walls of the shaft would stand firm without timber shoring, because this dense, compacted material would not crumble or slough away under its own weight. It also meant that the digging would be slower and harder, each bucket of spoil requiring more effort to free from the grip of the ancient ice. You accepted this trade without complaint, as you accepted all the conditions of the work, because the earth gave what it gave, and a digger could only respond with patience and the steady application of the tool. The rhythm of the afternoon had settled into a pattern that was different from the patterns of the earlier days. Now, with the till resisting each stroke of the mattock, you found yourself counting the strikes between the bucket's returns. It was not a conscious decision to count, but something your mind did on its own, a way of marking the passage of time in a space where there were no other markers. 7 strikes to loosen a chunk of the dense grey matrix. 8 strikes for a section where the stones were more numerous. 6 strikes for a softer pocket where the ice had left behind a deposit of finer silt. The numbers accumulated in the back of your thoughts without consequence, a quiet tally that was forgotten as soon as the bucket descended and the cycle began again. The sound of the rope had become a companion in the long stretches of waiting, a sound that you listened to with the same passive attention you gave to your own breathing. It began with the creak of the windlass drum as Stefan above took hold of the iron handle and began to turn, a low, rhythmic complaint of wood against wood that carried down the shaft in waves. Then the rope itself would tighten, the hemp fibers stretching and settling under the load, producing a faint, dry rustle that was more felt than heard, a vibration that traveled down the line and reached your hands where they rested on the bucket's rim. As the bucket rose, the sound changed, the creak of the drum continuing but joined now by the soft whisk of the rope passing over the rim of the shaft, a sound like the brush of a broom against a stone floor. And finally, when the bucket cleared the rim and Stefan walked it to the spoils pile, there was only the distant thud of his footsteps on hard ground and the occasional clatter of a stone falling from the load. Then the waiting would begin, the quiet interval while Stefan emptied the bucket and turned the handle the other way. During these intervals you stood in the dim light at the bottom of the shaft and did nothing except exist in the cool, still air, your body resting while your ears listened for the first hint of the bucket's return. The rope would begin its descent with a soft, slithering sound as it unwound from the drum, the coils loosening and dropping through the column of space, and you would watch the dark shape of the bucket grow larger against the pale disk of sky, its movements slow and slightly swinging, a pendulum marking the seconds of your life in the deep earth. The geometry of light in the shaft had become a thing you noticed without trying to notice it. When the sun was high, the circle of illumination on the floor was sharp and bright, a perfect disk of warm gold that moved across the clay as the hours passed. But in the late afternoon, as the sun sank lower and the angle of its rays grew shallower, that disk elongated and softened, becoming an oval of paler light that climbed the eastern wall and then faded into a diffuse glow that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The shadow of the windlass frame above fell across the rim in a distorted shape, a dark cross that slowly rotated with the sun's movement, and you could trace its progress across the upper walls by the way the light and dark played against the marks of your mattock. You had been working in the till for perhaps 2 hours when you uncovered a stone that was larger than any you had found in this layer so far. It was a boulder of dark grey granite, its surface smoothed and polished by the unimaginable pressures of the ice that had carried it here from some distant mountain range, and it was embedded in the western wall at the level of your waist. You worked around it with the mattock and the small hand-pick, loosening the dents till that held it in place, and after a long period of patient excavation, you were able to pry it free. It fell to the floor with a heavy, solid thud that vibrated up through the soles of your feet, and you knelt beside it to examine its surface. The granite was speckled with flecks of mica that glittered in the faint light, and there were thin veins of quartz running through it like the traces of old fractures. And on one side there was a deep groove worn into the stone by the passage of other rocks dragged across it by the ice. You ran your fingers along the groove, feeling its smooth, polished surface, and then you set the boulder aside with the other stones that would later line the well or build its rim. The bucket returned, and you filled it with the loosened till and the smaller stones that had surrounded the boulder, and then you tapped the signal and watched it rise, the rope creaking its familiar chorus above you. The sound of the windlass had become so constant, so woven into the fabric of the afternoons, that you sometimes forgot you were hearing it until a moment of silence fell, when Stefan paused to rest his hands on his knees. In those brief silences the shaft seemed to grow more still, more enclosed, as if the earth itself were holding its breath and waiting for the work to resume. Then the creak would begin again, and the world would return to its slow, steady rotation. The till continued downward with no sign of changing, its dense grey matrix packed with stones of every size from tiny pebbles to the large boulder you had just removed. The digging was slower now than it had been in the upper layers, perhaps half the speed, but the depth increased with each bucket, and that was all that mattered. You did not measure your progress in feet or inches. You measured it in the number of mattock strokes between rests, in the growing height of the walls above you, in the subtle changes of temperature and air quality that came with greater depth. Here, at what you estimated to be perhaps 18 feet below the surface, the air was noticeably cooler than the air above, a constant, neutral coolness that seemed to come from the earth itself, from the vast mass of rock and soil that extended downward for miles beneath your feet. It was not the coolness of water, not yet, but it was a coolness that hinted at the deeper places where water might dwell, where the heat of the summer sun could never reach. You paused in your work to drink from the water skin, tilting your head back and letting the warm liquid run down your throat. The skin was nearly empty again, its sides flaccid and soft, and you would need to refill it before the next day. The thought passed through your mind and was gone, replaced by the more immediate sensation of the water settling in your stomach and the slight refreshment it brought to your dry mouth. You hung the skin back on its peg and picked up the mattock again, finding the rhythm of the swing and the strike and the pull, the 7 or 8 or 6 strokes that freed another chunk of the ancient till. The shadow of the windlass cross had climbed higher on the eastern wall, its shape elongating and distorting as the sun sank lower, and you knew without looking at the sky that the afternoon was moving toward its close. The light in the shaft had taken on a faintly golden quality again, not the bright gold of morning, but a deeper, richer shade that seemed to gather in the hollows of the wall and pool in the depressions left by your mattock. This was the light of the golden hour, the brief period before sunset when the sun's rays passed through the thickest part of the air and were stripped of their blue tones, leaving only the warm colors that painters tried and failed to capture. In the shaft, that night was muted and indirect, but it was unmistakable, a softening of the shadows and a warming of the grey till that made the walls seem almost alive. You worked through this light, unwilling to stop while you could still see, and the bucket rose and fell in its steady rhythm, each load carrying away a small portion of the deep earth. The strokes of the mattock had become automatic, the motion so familiar that your body performed it without conscious direction, leaving your mind free to drift among the quiet thoughts that came in the stillness. You thought about the ice that had carried the granite boulder here, a sheet of frozen water so thick and heavy that it had scraped the very bones of the mountains and dragged them across the land, grinding everything in its path into the dense till that now resisted your mattock. You thought about the time that had passed since that ice melted, the thousands of years of rain and sun and the slow accumulation of soil above the till, the forests that had grown and died and grown again, the first people who had walked this land and named its hills and rivers. And you thought about the drought that had brought you here, to this particular hole in this particular square, digging downward through the layers of time in search of water that had fallen as rain in some distant age and then sunk deep into the earth to wait. The bucket descended empty, its dark shape swinging slightly as it came to rest on the floor beside you. And you knew that this would be the last load of the day. The light was fading too quickly now, the golden glow thinning to a pale amber and then to grey, and you could no longer see the details of the wall or the blade of your mattock with any clarity. You filled the bucket one final time, scraping together the loose till that had accumulated around your feet, and then you tapped the signal and watched it rise for the last time that day. The rope creaked and the drum turned and the bucket climbed through the dim column of air, growing smaller and darker until it disappeared over the rim and was gone. You gathered your tools in the gathering darkness, the mattock, the hand-pick, the water skin, the lamp that you had not needed to light during the afternoon, but that sat ready on its ledge. You placed them all in the empty bucket that Stefan would lower one more time, and then you climbed the ladder slowly, your legs heavy and your arms aching with the good tiredness of hard work. The air grew warmer as you rose, the coolness of the deep earth giving way to the lingering heat of the summer evening, and when your head cleared the rim and you looked out across the square, you saw that the world above was bathed in the soft, fading glow of twilight. Stefan was already coiling the rope, his movements slow and deliberate in the dimness, and you took the bucket from him and carried it to the spoils pile. The last load of till went on to the crest, adding its grey mass to the mound that had grown so large it now cast a long shadow across the square. You stood for a moment looking at the pile and at the windlass frame silhouetted against the pale western sky, its uprights dark and angular like the bones of some ancient beast. Then you turned and gathered your personal things, the water skin, the cloth, the small pouch of fossils that now held the graphia and the ridged shell, and a new addition, a tiny fragment of black stone that you had found embedded in the till, its surface polished to a high gloss by the ice that had carried it. The walk home was quiet, the village settling into its nightly stillness, the doors closed and the windows dark. You went inside and poured the last of the water from the jug into a bowl, washing the grey dust of the till from your face and hands and feeling the coolness of the liquid against your skin. The water ran brown into the cracks of the floor and disappeared, joining the deep earth from which it had come long ago. You ate a small supper and sat for a while in the darkness, listening to the silence of the drought night. And then you lay down on the straw mattress and closed your eyes. Behind your eyelids you could still see the shaft, the grey walls of till rising around you, the distant circle of sky, pale and far away. You could hear the creak of the windlass and the soft rustle of the rope and the dull thud of the mattock striking the dense, ancient earth. The sounds repeated in your memory, a quiet rhythm that carried you down into sleep, and you let them carry you, sinking slowly into the deep, still darkness where there was no work to do and no water to find, only the endless, patient quiet of the night. The depth of the shaft had reached a point, late in the afternoon of a day you had not bothered to number, where the light from above seemed to come from another world entirely. You stood on the clay floor with your head tilted back and your eyes fixed on the pale disk of sky that floated at the top of the dark column, a circle of soft, hazy blue that appeared no larger than a dinner plate held at arm's length. The walls rose around you in a smooth, continuous curve, their surface marked by the regular pattern of your mattock strokes, and the distance from where you stood to where the rim of the hole met the open air was now, by your best estimate, a little more than 22 feet. You had measured it that morning with the knotted string, lowering the weight until it touched the floor and then counting the knots as you pulled it back up, and the count had been 22 with perhaps a few inches to spare. It was a good depth, a respectable depth, deeper than many wells in the surrounding villages, but it was not yet deep enough because the walls were still dry and the air was still warm and there was no sign of the water that you had been sent to find. The layer you were excavating now was different from the grey till of the previous days. That dense, stone-filled matrix had given way, sometime around the 20th foot, to a new material that was finer and more uniform, a silty clay of a pale grey hue that reminded you of the slip used by potters to coat their vessels before firing. When you crushed a piece of it between your fingers, it broke apart into a soft, almost silky powder that clung to your skin in a fine film, and when you scraped it with the edge of the mattock, it peeled away in thin, smooth sheets that curled at the edges like parchment held too close to a flame. The color was the color of a winter sky reflected in still water, a grey so pale it was nearly white, and it gave the lower walls of the shaft a clean, austere appearance, as if you had descended into a chamber carved from soft stone rather than dug from the living earth. You worked more slowly now than you had in the upper layers, not because the material was harder, but because the hour was late and your body had already given its full measure for the day. The bucket had risen and fallen many times since morning, carrying away load after load of the pale grey clay, and the spoils pile above had grown until its crest was visible from the bottom of the shaft as a small irregular hump against the western sky whenever the bucket cleared the rim and left the opening unobstructed. Stefan was still at the windlass above, turning the handle with the same patient, unhurried rhythm he had maintained through all the long afternoons, though you could tell by the longer pauses between loads that his arms were tiring and his back was aching and he was ready, as you were, for the day to reach its natural end. The light in the shaft had changed in a way that told you, without needing to consult the sky, that the sun was now low over the western hills and the evening was beginning its slow advance across the village. The pale grey walls had taken on a faint warmth, a blush of gold that seemed to rise from the clay itself rather than fall from above, and the shadows in the corners of the floor had deepened to a soft velvety darkness that made the circle of light at the center seem brighter by contrast. You paused in your work to watch this light, letting the mattock rest against the wall and your arms hang loose at your sides. And you observed the way the golden glow moved across the surface of the clay, illuminating first one small irregularity and then another, the tiny stones and fossil fragments and ancient root casts that dotted the pale grey matrix like flecks of darker paint scattered on a light ground. One such fragment caught your eye, a thin dark line that ran horizontally across the wall at the level of your chest. You leaned closer, bringing your face near the clay so that you could see it clearly in the fading light, and you saw that it was not a line, but a narrow seam of a different material, something darker and more fibrous than the surrounding silt. When you picked at it with your fingernail, a small piece came away, and you held it up to the light and saw that it was a fragment of ancient wood, a sliver of branch or root that had been buried in this place for so long that it had turned to a soft, crumbly substance halfway between wood and coal. It left a dark smear on your palm, and you rubbed it away with your thumb before letting the fragment fall to the floor, where it joined the loose clay that would soon fill the bucket and be carried up to the light. The seam of ancient wood meant something, in the quiet way that all the small discoveries in the shaft meant something. It meant that this layer of pale grey silt had been deposited at a time when living things grew on the surface above, trees or shrubs whose roots had reached down into the sediment and then died, leaving behind these thin, dark traces of their existence. The wood was not waterlogged or even damp. It crumbled dry between your fingers, releasing a faint, dusty smell that was more mineral than organic, the smell of things that had ceased to be alive so long ago that even the memory of life had been pressed out of them by the weight of the ages. You let the pieces fall and turned back to the wall, noting the seam's continuation around the curve of the shaft, a thin, dark line that marked a moment in the deep history of this place, a year or a decade or a century when a root had grown here and then stopped growing, and then the slow rain of silt had covered it over and buried it and turned it to stone. The bucket descended again, its dark shape swinging slightly as it came to rest on the floor beside you. You filled it with the loose clay that had accumulated around your feet, the pale grey silt that broke apart so easily under the blade of the mattock, and then you tapped the signal and watched it rise. The rope creaked its familiar song, the windlass drum turned with its slow, steady complaint, and the bucket climbed through the column of dim gold light, growing smaller and darker until it passed the rim and disappeared. A few moments later, you heard the soft thud of Stem's footsteps and the quieter sound of the clay being emptied onto the spoils pile. And then the rope went slack, and the waiting began again. During this wait, the longest of the day because Stefan was moving slowly and the pile was far from the windlass, you turned your attention to the floor of the shaft. The surface was uneven, pocked with the marks of your mattock and the impressions of your feet, and scattered across it were the small stones and fossil fragments that you had picked out of the clay and set aside. You knelt and began to gather these pieces, placing them in a small pile against the wall, where they would wait until the time came to carry them up and add them to the collection above. The fossils were the same as before, the small ridged shells, the coiled spirals that the farmers called devil's toenails, and now a new form. A flat, disc-shaped object that might have been a section of a crinoid stem, a creature of the ancient sea that had looked something like a flower on a long stalk. You turned this disc over in your palm, feeling its smooth surfaces and the tiny hole at its center where the stem had once attached, and then you placed it with the others and continued gathering. The floor, once cleared of the larger fragments, was still uneven, and you spent the remainder of the weight leveling it with careful strokes of the mattock blade, shaving away the high points and filling the low spots with the fine, pale silt. A level floor was important for the stability of the ladder and for your own footing when you returned in the morning, and the act of creating that smooth surface was a quiet, methodical pleasure, a small act of order imposed on the raw chaos of the excavated earth. You worked slowly, checking the flatness with the straight edge of the mattock handle, and when you were finished, the entire circular floor was as smooth and even as a potter's wheel, a pale grey disc that caught the last of the golden light and held it like a shallow bowl of water. The bucket returned, empty, and you knew without being told that this was the last descent of the day. Stampen had sent it down clean, its leather sides free of clay, a signal that he was ready to stop and that you should prepare the shaft for the night. You gathered your tools and placed them in the bucket, the mattock with its blade wrapped in a scrap of cloth to protect the edge, the handpick, the small knife, the pouch of fossils that now held a dozen or more specimens, the lamp with its dish of cooling tallow, the water skin that hung limp and empty from its peg. Then you climbed the ladder slowly, rung by rung, pausing halfway up as you always did now, at the spot where the light from above was still bright enough to see the walls clearly. But the bottom of the shaft had already faded into shadow. This pause had become a small ritual of the evening, a moment of stillness between the dark of the deep earth and the light of the world above. You hung there on the ladder, with your hands gripping the rough wood of the rungs and your feet braced against the lower steps, and you looked at the walls that surrounded you. The shaft was a cylinder of pale grey clay, its surface marked by the regular pattern of your work, and it rose around you in a smooth, unbroken curve that ascended toward the circle of sky like the inside of a great stone pipe. The walls were dry, completely dry, showing no gleam of moisture even at this depth where the water should have begun to seep from the pores of the earth. The drought had reached down here, you understood, down through the soil and the till and the pale grey silt, sucking the last traces of dampness from the deep ground and leaving behind only this clean, austere dryness that felt almost like the inside of a kiln before the fire is lit. You looked at the neatness of the wall, the straightness of the lines, the even spacing of the mattock marks that spiraled upward like the thread of a screw. The work was good, you thought, in the quiet, unboastful way that a craftsman thinks of his own labor. The shaft was true, the walls were sound, and the depth increased each day by the same steady increments that would eventually, if the earth was kind and the drought did not extend too far, reach the hidden water that the village needed. The thought was not a hope or a fear, it was simply a fact, a statement of the situation as it stood, without emotion or expectation. You resumed your climb, pulling yourself up the remaining rungs until your head cleared the rim and the full expanse of the evening square opened around you. The air above was warm and still, carrying the familiar smells of dust and dry thatch, and the faint smoke of cook fires. The sky was a deep, clear blue in the east, shading to gold and pink and pale orange in the west, where the sun had just disappeared behind the low hills. The windlass frame stood dark against that glowing sky, its uprights and crossbar and the curve of the drum forming a stark, angular silhouette that reminded you of a gallows, though the thought passed without weight and was gone before you could examine it. Stefan was standing beside the spoils pile, his hands pressed to the small of his back and his face turned toward the west, where the last of the light lingered. He did not speak when you emerged, and you did not speak to him, but you walked over and stood beside him, looking at the pile that had grown so large over the days and weeks of the work. It was a substantial mound now, taller than a man and broad at the base, its slopes composed of all the layers you had passed through. The pale yellow clay of the surface, the darker mustard loam, the grey till packed with stones, and the new pale grey silt that made the top of the pile look almost white in the fading light. The fossils you had collected over the weeks sat in a small cluster at the edge of the pile, a miniature museum of the deep earth, their shapes strange and delicate against the rough clay. "Heavy work," Stem said, the words falling into the quiet with the weight of stones dropped into still water. You nodded, a single dip of your chin that was answer enough. Then you walked back to the shaft and lifted the heavy oak board from where it leaned against the windlass frame. The board was rough and splintered, its surface greyed by weather and stained dark in places where the clay had been wiped from your hands, and it fit across the rim of the shaft with a few inches to spare on every side. You laid it down carefully, listening to the solid thud as it settled into place, and the shaft was closed, the darkness below sealed away from the fading light above. The windlass stood over the covered hole like a silent guardian, its rope coiled neatly on the drum and its iron handle pointing toward the north, where it would wait for the morning. You gathered your personal things from the bucket and slung the water skin over your shoulder, its empty weight a reminder that you would need to fill it from the dwindling jug before you slept. The pouch of fossils went into the pocket of your tunic, its contents clicking softly together as you moved. Stefan had already begun to walk away, his slow, careful steps carrying him across the square toward his own house, and you followed at a distance, the two of you moving through the evening quiet like figures in a dream, your shadows long and dark on the pale, dusty ground. The village was settling into its nightly rhythm, the small sounds of doors closing and voices murmuring behind walls, and the occasional cry of a child that was quickly hushed. You passed the stone trough that normally held water for the cattle, the one that had been dry for so long that a fine layer of dust had settled into its bottom, and a single, withered leaf lay curled in the deepest corner. The leaf was brown and brittle, its edges curled inward like a clutching hand, and it stirred slightly as you passed, moved by the faint disturbance of the air your body made. Beyond the trough, the linden tree near the churchyard wall stood with its leaves hanging limp and grey, their surfaces coated with the fine dust that rose from the square with every passing footstep, and then settled back, a slow, patient accumulation that covered everything with the same pale film. You reached your house and pushed open the door, stepping into the warm, dark interior that smelled of old wood and cold ash and the faint, sour scent of the rye bread that sat wrapped in a cloth on the bench. You set your things down and poured water from the jug into a wooden bowl, then washed your face and hands slowly, feeling the grit of the pale grey clay dissolve and run away in thin brown rivulets that disappeared into the cracks of the earthen floor. The water was warm and tasted of the clay from which the jug was made, but it was wet and clean, and it did what water was meant to do, and that was enough. You ate a small supper sitting on the bench by the cold hearth, the bread and a piece of dried meat, and the last of the pickled onions from the clay pot. The food was simple and familiar, and you chewed it slowly while the light outside the oiled cloth window faded from deep blue to black. The sounds of the village faded with the light, the doors falling silent and the voices ceasing, and the last trace of smoke from the cook fires dissipating into the still, warm air. The drought night settled over the square like a blanket, heavy and close, pressing down on the thatched roofs and the dusty lanes and the covered mouth of the well that was now 22 feet deep and still dry. When the meal was finished, you sat for a while in the darkness, your back against the cool wall of the house and your hands resting loose in your lap. The pouch of fossils sat beside you, and you opened it and poured the contents onto the bench, arranging the small stones and shells and fragments of ancient life in a neat row. There was the graphia with its coiled spiral, the ridged shell no larger than a thumbnail, the flat disc of the crinoid stem with its tiny central hole, and a dozen other pieces, some identifiable and some merely suggestive of forms that had once been alive. You looked at them in the dimness, their shapes barely visible against the dark wood of the bench, and you thought about the sea that had once covered this land, and the creatures that had lived in it, and died and sunk into the silt and been turned to stone. The thoughts were large and quiet, and they filled the small room with a calm, undemanding presence. You gathered the fossils and returned them to the pouch, then lay down on the straw mattress and pulled the thin blanket over your legs. The night was warm and still, the air in the room heavy and close, and you could hear nothing except your own breathing and the faint, distant sound of a dog barking somewhere on the far side of the village. The bark was a single, brief sound that rose and fell and then was gone, swallowed by the silence that followed. You closed your eyes and let your body sink into the mattress, feeling the weight of the day settle into your bones and muscles, the familiar ache of the mattock work and the ladder climb, and the long hours standing in the cool, dim shaft. Behind your eyelids, you could see the pale grey walls of the new layer, smooth and dry and lit by the last of the golden light. You could see the thin, dark seam of ancient wood running around the circumference of the shaft, and the smooth floor that you had levelled with such care, and the circle of sky high above that seemed to belong to a different world. The images were still and quiet, like paintings on the inside of your closed eyes, and they faded slowly as sleep approached, dissolving into the deeper darkness that lay beyond thought and memory. The well was deeper now than it had been this morning, and tomorrow it would be deeper still, and the water that you sought was somewhere below, hidden in the pale grey silt or in the layer beneath it or the layer beneath that. You did not know when you would reach it, and the not knowing was not a worry or a frustration, but simply a fact, like the depth of the shaft and the colour of the clay and the dryness of the walls. You would continue to dig, one bucket at a time, one day after another, until the water came or until the earth became too hard to break, or until the elders told you to stop. That was the nature of the work, and you accepted it as you accepted the night and the silence and the slow, patient descent into sleep that carried you down into the dark, where there were no wells and no drought and no waiting, only the endless quiet rest of the deep earth. The evening had settled over the village in layers, the way silt settles in still water, each particle finding its place in the slow, patient order of things. You walked away from the covered mouth of the well with your tools cleaned and your water skin empty over your shoulder, and the small pouch of fossils bumping gently against your hip with each step. The square behind you was quiet now, the windlass frame standing alone against the fading western sky, its uprights dark and thin like the strokes of a pen drawn across pale paper. Stefan had already disappeared around the corner of the common house, his footsteps fading into the general silence, and you were alone on the lane that led past the stone trough and the linden tree and the row of small houses with their doors closed against the lingering heat. The blue hour had begun. You had heard the old people call it that, the brief time after sunset and before true darkness, when the sky turns a deep, luminous blue, a color that seems to rise from the earth itself rather than fall from above. In the drought summer of 1540, the blue hour came every evening like a gift that asked for nothing in return, a brief respite from the flat white glare of the days. The heat of the afternoon still radiated from the ground and the walls and the thatched roofs, but the light had softened into something that could be looked at directly, something that rested the eyes instead of straining them. You walked through this blue light with your head up and your gaze moving slowly across the familiar shapes of the village, seeing them as if for the first time or as if for the last, in the way that tiredness makes the ordinary appear strange and precious. The stone trough came first. It sat at the corner where the lane from the square met the wider track that led out toward the remaining fields, the ones that had been planted in the spring before the rains had failed, and now stood with their stunted rye and barley barely reaching knee-height, the heads small and sparse and already turning brown long before the harvest should have begun. The trough had been carved from a single block of grey sandstone many years ago, by a stonemason whose name no one remembered, and its sides were worn smooth in places where countless cattle and sheep and goats had pressed their necks to drink. Now it held no water, only a fine layer of pale dust that had blown in from the square and settled in the bottom like the lees of a wine barrel. A single wilted leaf lay curled in the deepest corner, blown there by some stray gust of the drought wind, and its edges were brown and brittle and curled inward toward the stem, as if trying to hide from the dryness. You stopped beside the trough and looked down into its empty basin, not because you expected to see anything, but because the act of stopping was part of the rhythm of the evening walk, a small pause that marked the transition from the work of the day to the rest of the night. The dust in the bottom was the same pale grey as the silt you had been excavating from the deep shaft, and you wondered in an idle, unengaged way if the dust from the square and the dust from the well's depths were the same substance, carried upward by your buckets and scattered by the wind, settling everywhere in a fine, even film that covered the village like a second skin. The thought passed and was gone, and you moved on, leaving the empty trough behind. The linden tree stood next, its broad canopy spreading over the lane where it passed the churchyard wall. In a normal summer, a summer with rain enough to keep the leaves green and full, the linden would have been a place of shade and gathering, the older villagers sitting on the stone bench beneath it, through the long afternoons, talking in low voices or saying nothing at all, simply being together in the cool, fragrant air. But this summer the leaves hung limp and dull, their edges curled inward, and their surfaces coated with the same pale dust that covered everything. The green had faded to a grey green, then to a yellow green, and now in the blue hour the leaves appeared almost black, dark shapes against the deeper darkness of the sky. A few had fallen already, not because autumn had come, but because the tree was sacrificing what it could not sustain, shedding its burden one leaf at a time in the slow, silent bargain that all living things make with drought. You passed under the canopy and felt the air change. A slight coolness that was not real coolness, but only the absence of the sun's direct heat. The memory of shade that the tree still held in its branches long after the light had gone. The stone bench beneath the linden was empty, its surface covered with a thin scattering of the fallen leaves and the ever-present dust. You did not sit. Sitting was for later, for the darkness of your own house, for the slow unwinding of the day's tensions. You simply passed through, your footsteps soft on the packed earth of the lane, and emerged on the other side where the houses began again in a close row. The first house belonged to the widow Gerhild, an old woman whose husband had died of a fever 3 winters past, and whose children had all married and moved to other villages, where the land was better and the work more plentiful. Her door was closed, as all the doors were closed, but a thin line of yellow light showed at the gap between the bottom of the door and the stone threshold, the glow of a single tallow lamp burning somewhere inside. You could hear nothing from within, no voices or movements or the clatter of cooking pots, only the silence that seemed to emanate from the house like a held breath. The widow Gerhild was inside, you knew, sitting by her cold hearth or lying on her narrow bed, waiting for the night to pass and the morning to come, the way everyone in the village waited now, with the patience that had been worn smooth by the long weeks of drought. The next house was larger, belonging to a family whose name you did know, the Weavers, who had 5 children and a small plot of vegetables behind the house that had failed, along with everything else. One of the children, a boy of perhaps 6 or 7, was sitting on the stone step in front of the closed door, his knees drawn up to his chest and his arms wrapped around them. He did not look up as you passed, his gaze fixed on something in the middle distance that you could not see, a point, somewhere between the dust of the lane and the darkening sky. His face was thin and pale in the blue light, and his hair was the color of dry straw, and he sat so still that you might have thought him a carving if you had not seen the slight rise and fall of his breathing. You did not speak to him, and he did not speak to you, and the distance between you as you passed was no more than the width of the lane, but felt as vast as the space between the stars. This was the way of the village in the drought summer. You understood without having to put the understanding into words. People moved through their days and nights with the minimum of motion and sound, conserving not only the water that was growing scarce, but also the energy that speech and gesture required. The drought had stripped away the small courtesies and casual conversations that had once filled the lanes in the square, leaving only the essential shapes of human interaction. A nod here, a glance there, the quiet acknowledgement of shared endurance. You were part of this reduction, as much a creature of the dry season as the linden tree shedding its leaves or the stone trough holding its dust. You walked through the village in the blue hour, and you saw only what was there to be seen, and you felt only what was there to be felt, which was very little, a low, constant hum of tiredness and acceptance, and the faint, distant awareness that tomorrow the work would resume. The lane curved slightly to the left, following the contour of the low hill on which the village had been built long ago, and you came to a place where you could see across the thatched roofs to the square beyond. The spile's pile was visible from here, a pale mound rising against the darker shapes of the houses on the far side, its crest catching the last of the blue light and holding it like a small terrestrial moon. The windlass frame stood beside it, a dark cross-hatch of timber against the sky, and you could see the oak board covering the mouth of the shaft, a flat, rectangular shadow at the center of the square. The well side looked different from this distance, smaller and more orderly, a neat arrangement of pile and frame and covered hole that seemed to belong to a different world than the one you inhabited when you stood at the bottom of the shaft and looked up at the distant circle of sky. You paused again, not because you needed to rest, but because the view was a pleasing composition, the kind of arrangement that a painter might choose if there were painters in Saxony in the summer of 1540. The pale mound, the dark frame, the blue sky deepening toward black in the east, the first faint stars beginning to appear above the eastern hills. All of it came together in a way that satisfied some quiet part of your mind, the part that appreciated order and balance and the slow, patient work of human hands. You stood there for perhaps a minute, perhaps 2, letting your eyes rest on the scene, and then you turned and continued along the lane toward your own house at the edge of the village. The last house before your own belonged to a young couple whose names you had never learned, a man and a woman who had arrived the previous autumn from somewhere to the south and taken over an empty cottage that had been abandoned when its former owner died without heirs. They kept to themselves, speaking little to anyone, and you saw them only occasionally, the man walking out to the fields in the grey light of dawn, the woman drawing water from the communal trough before it ran dry. Tonight their door was closed like all the others, but you could hear a low murmur of voices from within, the sound of 2 people talking quietly in the darkness, saying the small, necessary things that people say when the day is done and the night is long. The sound was comforting in a way you could not have explained, a reminder that life continued in the village despite the drought and the dust and the long, slow wait for rain that did not come. Your own house appeared round the next bend, a low shape of wattle and daub with a thatched roof that needed mending in one corner where the straw had pulled away from the ridgepole. You had noticed the gap weeks ago and made a note to repair it when the well was finished, when there was time for such small tasks. The door opened with a familiar creak, the leather hinges dry and stiff from the heat, and you stepped inside and closed it behind you, shutting out the blue light and the dust and the silence of the village. The interior of the house was dark and warm, the air still and heavy with the smell of old wood and cold ash, and the faint sour scent of the rye bread that sat wrapped in its cloth on the bench. You moved through the darkness by memory, your feet finding the familiar path from the door to the bench to the hearth, to the corner where the clay water jug sat on its low stool. You knelt beside the jug and lifted it, feeling its weight, the slosh of the remaining water against the curved sides. There was enough for one more day, perhaps two if you were careful, drawing only what you needed for drinking and the small necessary washing of face and hands that marked the end of each day's work. After that, you would need to walk to the river with the jug and the leather bucket, and carry back what water remained in the shrunken channel, a task that took half a day and left you tired in a different way, a tiredness that came from walking under the sun with a heavy burden instead of standing in the cool dimness of the shaft. You poured a small amount of water into the wooden bowl, just enough to cover the bottom, and you dipped your cloth into it and wiped your face slowly, feeling the grit of the pale grey clay dissolve and lift away. The water was warm, as it always was by this hour, but it was wet and it was clean, and it did what water was meant to do, carrying away the dust of the day's labor and leaving your skin cool and damp in the still air. You washed your hands next, rubbing the cloth between your fingers and over your palms, watching the water in the bowl turn from clear to pale brown as the clay from the deep shaft mixed with the clay of the surface that had settled on your skin during the walk home. When the washing was done, you emptied the bowl onto the earthen floor, the water disappearing into the cracks with a soft, brief sound, and then you hung the cloth on its peg and sat down on the bench by the cold hearth. The hearth was a shallow depression in the floor, lined with flat stones that had been blackened by years of fires, and it was cold now. Had been cold for weeks, because there was no point in burning fuel for warmth when the nights were as warm as the days, and because cooking was done quickly and simply, a matter of eating the cold bread and the dried meat and the pickled vegetables that remained in their clay pots. A small pile of ash sat in the center of the hearth, the remains of the last fire you had lit back when the drought was still new and people still hoped that the rains would return. The ash was pale grey and finely textured, almost identical in color to the silt you had been excavating from the deep shaft, and the resemblance struck you now as you sat looking at it, a small connection between the world above and the world below, the fire that had been and the ancient sea that had been, both of them reduced to this same fine grey powder that blew away on the wind or settled into the cracks of the floor. You ate your supper slowly, the bread and a small piece of hard cheese, and a single dried apple that had been stored since the previous autumn, and was now leathery and sweet and chewy, its flavor concentrated by the long months of waiting. The food was simple and familiar, and you chewed each bite thoroughly, letting the tastes mingle on your tongue before swallowing. The bread was dry and crumbly, the cheese sharp and salty, the apple a burst of unexpected sweetness that lingered after everything else was gone. You washed the meal down with a small sip of water from the cup, and then you sat for a while in the darkness, doing nothing, thinking nothing, simply existing in the quiet of the evening. Outside, the village had settled into the deep stillness of the drought night. The blue hour had passed, giving way to true darkness, a darkness that was almost complete, because the moon was new, and the stars, though bright in the clear, dry air, gave only a faint, silvery light that did not penetrate the closed doors and shuttered windows of the houses. No dogs barked, no children cried, no voices murmured behind the walls. The silence was so profound that you could hear your own heartbeat if you listened for it, a low, steady thud that marked the passage of the seconds, the minutes, the long hours of the night. You thought about the well as you sat there, the shaft that waited under its oak board in the center of the square, 22 feet deep and still dry. You thought about the layers you had passed through, the yellow clay and the mustard loam and the grey till packed with stones and the pale grey silt of the current depth. Each layer had its own character, its own color and texture, and the small quiet stories it told about the ancient past of this place. and below the pale grey silt, somewhere deeper still, lay the water that the village needed. The water that had fallen as rain in some distant age and sunk into the earth and waited, patient and still, for someone to dig deep enough to find it. You did not know how deep that water lay. There was no way to know except to keep digging, to keep descending through the layers, one bucket at a time, until the walls began to darken with moisture, and the air grew cool and damp, and the first seep of water appeared at the bottom of the shaft. The thought was not a hope or a fear or a prayer. It was simply a fact, a condition of the work that you had accepted when you first marked the circle in the square and lifted the digging bar and let it fall against the hard, dry ground. You would dig until the water came, or until the elders told you to stop, or until you could dig no deeper. That was the nature of the well-digger's trade, and you had known it all your life, had learned it from your father and your father's father, who had dug wells in other villages, other summers, some of them dry and some of them wet, all of them long and slow and patient. You stood up from the bench and stretched your arms above your head, feeling the pull of the muscles across your shoulders and back. The tiredness of the day had settled deep into your body, a heavy, pleasant fatigue that promised good sleep and restful darkness. You walked to the bed in the corner of the house, the simple wooden frame with its straw-filled mattress and the thin blanket folded at the foot. You lay down and pulled the blanket over your legs, though the night was warm enough that you did not need it, and you closed your eyes and let your body sink into the straw. The sounds of the day echoed faintly in your memory, the creak of the windlass and the soft rustle of the rope and the dull thud of the mattock, striking the pale grey clay. You could see the walls of the shaft rising around you, smooth and dry and marked by the regular pattern of your work, and the circle of sky high above, a distant disk of blue that was now black, now scattered with the faint points of the emerging stars. The images were calm and quiet, and they faded slowly as sleep approached, dissolving into the deeper darkness that lay beyond thought and memory. Tomorrow you would return to the shaft and lower yourself down the ladder into the cool, still air, and you would take up the mattock and resume the slow, patient descent. The bucket would rise and fall, the windlass would creak its familiar song, and the pale grey silt would give way to whatever layer lay beneath it, a layer that might hold water or might hold only more of the dry, ancient earth. But that was tomorrow, and tonight there was only the darkness, and the silence and the slow, steady rhythm of your breathing, carrying you down into sleep as gently and surely as the rope carried the bucket into the depths of the shaft. The village slept around you, the houses dark and still, the lanes empty, the stone trough holding its dust and its single wilted leaf. The linden tree stood over the empty bench, its leaves hanging limp and quiet, gathering the faint starlight on their dusty surfaces. The spoils pile glowed pale in the square, a mound of all the days of your labour, and beneath the oak board the shaft descended through the layers of yellow and mustard and grey and pale grey, down into the silent, waiting earth. And in the small house at the edge of the village, you slept, your body heavy and your mind empty, letting the night carry you toward the morning and the work that waited there. The house was dark when you opened the door for the final time that day, the darkness of a room that had been closed against the sun since morning, and now held only the faint, warm smell of old wood and cold ash, and the dry, sour scent of the rye bread that sat wrapped in its cloth on the bench. You stepped inside and pushed the door shut behind you, the leather hinges creaking once and then falling silent, and you stood for a moment in the blackness, letting your eyes adjust to the deeper dark, letting your body feel the weight of the roof above and the walls around and the packed earth beneath your feet. The world outside was gone now, the square and the windlass and the spoils pile and the covered mouth of the shaft, all of it left behind on the other side of the door, and what remained was only this small, familiar space and the long, slow hours until morning. You moved through the dark by memory, your feet finding the path from the door, to the bench, to the hearth, to the corner where the clay water jug sat on its low stool. The jug was cool against your palm when you touched it, the fired clay holding the memory of the deep earth from which it had been dug and shaped and fired long before the drought of 1540 had been thought of. You lifted it and felt the weight of the remaining water, the slosh of the liquid against the curved sides, and you knew without measuring that there was enough for the morning and perhaps a little more. enough to wash your face and hands one more time before you return to the shaft and resume the slow, patient descent. The thought was not a worry or a calculation. It was simply a fact, one of the many small facts that filled your mind in the quiet of the evening, each one as unremarkable as the next. You poured a small amount of water into the wooden bowl, just enough to wet the cloth, and you knelt beside the hearth and washed your face slowly, drawing the damp fabric across your forehead and cheeks and the bridge of your nose, feeling the grit of the pale grey clay lift away and dissolve into the water. The clay had been with you all day, a fine dust that settled on your skin and in your hair and in the folds of your tunic, the same pale grey silt that you had been excavating from the deep shaft. The layer that lay 22 feet below the surface of the square and extended downward into depths you had not yet reached. It was a clean, fine substance, almost silky to the touch, and it washed away easily, leaving your skin cool and smooth in the still, warm air of the house. You washed your hands next, rubbing the cloth between your fingers and over your palms and the backs of your hands, working the water into the creases and the calluses and the small rough patches where the handle of the mattock had worn the skin over the long days of the work. The water in the bowl turned from clear to pale brown, the color of weak tea or of the river after a rain, though there had been no rain, and the river was only a memory of water between its cracked mud banks. You emptied the bowl onto the earthen floor, the liquid disappearing into the cracks with a soft, brief sound, and then you hung the cloth on its peg and rose to your feet, your knees cracking slightly from the long hours of standing in the shaft. The bed waited in the corner of the house, a simple wooden frame with a mattress of straw that rustled softly when you sat down on its edge. You unlaced your boots slowly, the leather thongs stiff with dust and dried sweat, and you pulled them off and set them beside the bed, where they would wait for the morning. Your feet were pale and cool against the packed earth of the floor, and you flexed your toes, feeling the small ache in the arches from the hours of standing and climbing and bracing against the walls of the shaft. The ache was familiar, a companion of the evenings, and it would fade by morning, leaving only the faint memory of the day's work in the muscles and bones. You lay back on the mattress and felt the straw shift beneath you, adjusting to the weight of your body, the hollows and the ridges and the small, soft sounds of the dried stalks rubbing against one another. The ceiling above was low and dark, the underside of the thatch visible as a rough, shadowed surface that caught the faintest light from somewhere, perhaps the stars through the small gap where the thatch had pulled away from the ridgepole, a tiny point of silvery grey that was almost not there. You looked at that point for a long moment, letting your eyes rest on its faint, distant glow. And then you closed your eyes and let the darkness of the house become the darkness behind your eyelids. A different kind of dark, deeper and more complete. The sounds of the day echoed faintly in your memory, not as distinct noises but as a kind of rhythm, a slow, steady pulse that had governed the hours from the first descent of the morning to the last climb of the evening. The creak of the windlass drum as Stefan turned the handle, the soft rustle of the hemp rope against the rim of the shaft, the dull thud of the mattock striking the pale grey clay. These sounds had woven themselves into the fabric of your mind, and now in the stillness of the night they played again, a quiet, repetitive music that asked for nothing and meant nothing, only the background of a life spent digging into the dry, patient earth. You thought about the shaft as you lay there, the dark column that descended through the layers of yellow and mustard and grey and pale grey, the walls smooth and straight and marked by the regular pattern of your mattock strokes. You could see it clearly in your mind's eye, the way you had seen it 1,000 times during the long afternoons, the circle of clay floor at your feet and the circle of sky high above, and the walls rising between them like the inside of a great stone pipe. The image was calm and still, a picture drawn in shades of grey and brown and pale cream, and it filled your thoughts without demanding attention, the way a familiar room fills the awareness of someone who has lived in it for many years. The depth of the shaft was now 22 feet and some inches, measured that morning with a knotted string and the small weight that you had lowered until it touched the floor and then drawn up again, counting the knots one by one as they passed through your fingers. 22 feet was a good depth, a respectable depth, deeper than many wells in the surrounding villages, and yet it was not deep enough because the walls were still dry and the air was still warm and there was no sign of the water that the village needed. You did not know how much deeper you would have to dig. There was no way to know except to continue, to descend through the pale grey silt and whatever layer lay beneath it, until the walls began to darken with moisture, and the air grew cool and damp, and the first seep of water appeared at the bottom of the shaft. The not knowing was not a frustration or a worry. It was simply a condition of the work, like the weight of the mattock, or the roughness of the rope, or the coolness of the deep earth against your skin. You had known when you began that you might dig for many days, many weeks, and find nothing but dry clay and ancient stones and the small silent fossils of creatures that had lived and died in seas that no longer existed. And if the water was deeper than you could reach, deeper than the strength of your arms and the patience of the village could sustain, then the elders would tell you to stop, and you would stop, and the shaft would be covered with the oak board and left to wait for a wetter year, when someone else might continue the descent. That was the nature of the well-digger's trade, and you accepted it as you accepted the darkness of the house and the warmth of the summer night, and the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing. The fossils you had collected sat in their small pouch on the bench across the room, invisible in the darkness, but present in your mind as a neat row of shapes and textures. The graphia with its coiled spiral and its fine growth lines, the small ridged shell no larger than a thumbnail, the flat disc of the crinoid stem with its tiny central hole, the fragment of ancient wood that had crumbled between your fingers and left a dark smear on your palm. These objects had no use, no value that anyone in the village would recognize, but they pleased you in a quiet, undemanding way, a small record of the deep past that your labor had brought to light. They would sit on the bench through the night and wait for the morning, and in the morning you would look at them again, turning each one over in your palm before you left for the square and the shaft and the slow, patient work of the new day. The village outside was silent, a silence so deep and complete that it seemed to have a texture, a weight that pressed against the walls of the house and the closed door and the small dark window with its covering of oiled cloth. No dogs barked in the lanes. No children cried behind the neighboring walls. No voices murmured in the distance. The drought had taken even the night sounds, the rustle of leaves and the chirp of insects, and the soft, distant hoot of an owl hunting over the fields. What remained was only the stillness, the vast, patient stillness of a world waiting for rain that did not come, and you lay within that stillness, as a stone lies within the earth, unmoving and unmoved, a part of the quiet that surrounded everything. You thought about the morning that would come, the grey light seeping through the oiled cloth window, the slow rise from the straw mattress, the simple breakfast of hard bread and water, the walk through the empty lanes to the square. You would find the windlass standing where you had left it, its uprights dark against the pale sky, and the oak board covering the mouth of the shaft. You would lift the board and set it aside, and he would look down into the darkness of the hole, the circle of clay floor far below, the ladder descending into the dimness. And then you would lower yourself rung by rung, feeling the temperature change as you passed from the warm air of the surface to the cool, neutral air of the depths. The air that smelled of dry clay and ancient silt and nothing else. Stefan would arrive, as he always did, his footsteps slow and careful on the hard ground, his hand pressed to the small of his back where the years had settled into a permanent ache. He would take his place at the windlass handle, and you would take your place at the bottom of the shaft, and the bucket would begin its slow descent, turning slightly at the end of the rope, growing larger and darker as it approached your waiting hands. You would fill it with the loose clay from the floor, the pale grey silt that broke apart so easily under the blade of the mattock, and you would tap the signal and watch it rise, the rope creaking its familiar song, the windlass drum turning with its slow, steady complaint. The work would continue as it had continued for all the days before, the same motions in the same order, the same quiet sounds in the same enclosed space. The depth would increase by inches, slow inches that accumulated without fanfare, and the spoils pile above would grow a little taller, a little wider, its crest catching the morning light and holding it through the long, hot afternoon. You would find more stones embedded in the clay, some of them small and round and smooth by ancient water, others large and angular and bearing the scars of the ice that had carried them here from distant mountains. You would find more fossils, perhaps another graphia or a ridged shell or something new, a form you had not seen before, a fragment of a creature whose name you would never know. And you would set these small discoveries on the ledge you had cut into the wall, adding them to the collection that waited there in the dimness, a museum of the deep earth that only you would ever see. The day would pass in its slow, patient rhythm, the light shifting from the bright gold of morning to the flat white of midday to the warm amber of afternoon. The shadows would move across the walls, climbing higher as the sun sank lower, and the circle of sky above would change from pale blue to deeper blue to the soft, glowing gold of the evening. You would work through these changes, not observing them directly, but aware of them in the way that a person is aware of the passage of time without counting the hours. A low, constant hum of awareness that underlay the more immediate focus of the mattock and the bucket and the waiting. And when the light had faded to the point where you could no longer see the blade of the mattock against the clay, you would call up to Stefan that the day was done, and he would lower the bucket one last time, empty and clean, and he would place your tools inside and climb the ladder slowly, rung by rung, emerging into the warm evening air of the square. You would cover the shaft with the oak board and coil the rope and gather your personal things, the water skin and the cloth and the small pouch of fossils. You would walk home through the quiet lanes, past the empty stone trough and the linden tree with its limp, dusty leaves, past the houses with their closed doors, and you would enter your own house and wash your face and hands and eat your simple supper and lie down on the straw mattress, just as you had done tonight, and would do again tomorrow, and all the tomorrows, until the water came or the work was finished. The thought of these repetitions was not tiresome or dull. It was comforting in a way that you could not have explained, a recognition of the order that existed beneath the surface of things, the slow, steady pulse of days and nights and work and rest that had governed human life since the first person dug the first hole in the ground. You were part of that order, a small part but a necessary one, and the knowledge settled into your mind like the straw settling beneath your weight, finding its place among the other quiet thoughts that filled the darkness. The air in the house was warm and still, carrying no scent of rain or change, only the familiar smells of old wood and cold ash and the dry, sour bread. The drought continued outside, pressing down on the village and the fields and the shrunken river, and it would continue tomorrow, and the day after, and perhaps for many days beyond that. But here, in the small dark room, there was only the present moment, the sensation of the straw against your back, and the weight of the blanket over your legs, and the slow, steady rhythm of your breathing. You let your thoughts drift, not holding on to any one image or idea, but letting them pass like clouds across the circle of sky above the shaft, each one appearing and then fading, replaced by the next. The graphia turning in your palm, the smooth grey of the till packed with stones, the thin dark seam of ancient wood running around the circumference of the shaft, the steady flame of the tallow lamp in the still air, the distant creak of the windlass, the cool touch of the deep clay against your skin. All of these impressions floated through your mind without urgency or weight, a quiet procession of the day's small moments, and you watched them pass with the same detached attention you would give to the slow drift of a high, thin cloud. The silence of the night deepened, the last faint sounds of the village fading into nothing, and the darkness behind your eyelids became complete. A blackness that had no shape or texture or depth. The straw mattress cradled your body, its ridges and hollows adjusted now to the contours of your back and shoulders and hips, and you felt the good tiredness of the day settle into your bones, a heavy, pleasant fatigue that promised rest and renewal. The muscles of your arms and shoulders, which had swung the mattock and guided the bucket and climbed the ladder, relaxed one by one, letting go of the small tensions that had accumulated through the long hours of work. Your breathing slowed, each inhalation drawing the warm, still air into your lungs, each exhalation releasing it back into the darkness of the room. The rhythm was automatic now, a function of the body that required no attention, and your mind followed it down, sinking deeper into the quiet, letting go of the thoughts and images that had filled the evening. The shaft was still there, in the back of your awareness, the dark column descending through the layers of yellow and mustard and grey and pale grey, but it was distant now, a picture seen through deep water, its details blurred and softened. The village slept around you, the houses dark and still, the lanes empty, the stone trough holding its dust and its single wilted leaf through the long hours of the night. The linden tree stood over the empty bench, its leaves hanging limp and quiet, gathering the faint starlight on their dusty surfaces. The spoils pile glowed pale in the square, a mound of all the days of your labor, and beneath the oak board, the shaft descended into the silent, waiting earth. The walls dry and smooth, the floor level and clean, the tools resting against the clay where you had left them. Tomorrow the work would continue, the same motions in the same order, the same quiet sounds in the same enclosed space. The depth would increase by inches, and the bucket would rise and fall, and the windlass would creak its familiar song. You would descend into the cool dimness and take up the mattock and resume the slow, patient excavation of the deep earth. But that was tomorrow, and tonight there was only the darkness, and the silence, and the slow, steady rhythm of your breathing, carrying you down into sleep, as gently and surely as the rope carried the bucket into the depths of the shaft. The drought night held its breath over the village, a warm, still darkness that was almost complete, broken only by the faint, silvery glimmer of the stars in the clear, dry air. No rain fell, no wind stirred, no sound disturbed the profound quiet that had settled over the thatched roofs and the dusty lanes and the covered mouth of the well. The world waited, patient and silent, for the morning and the work, and the slow, inevitable turning of the days. And in the small house at the edge of the village, you slept, your body heavy and your mind empty, letting the night carry you toward the dawn and the descent that waited there.